Hello, my dear friends. They didn't die of overdose in dark alleys. They faded quietly on lace-lined beds, with morphine in their veins and laudanum on their breath. Victorian addicts didn't look like depraved people. They wore pearl necklaces, went to church, raised children, and withered behind heavy curtains. No one spoke of them. No one warned the next. And the vial passed from one trembling hand to another. Tonight, you'll follow the silent horror behind the velvet curtains, where addiction wears corsets and smiles. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to walk into a Victorian pharmacy, rows of laudanum bottles would be lined up on the shelves as if they were no different from jars of sugar or tins of tea. The bottles were not hidden in locked cabinets, nor sold in whispers. They were displayed in full view, neatly arranged, labelled with simple instructions, and offered to anyone with a few coins in hand. For pain, for coughs, for sleepless nights, laudanum was the first choice. Its presence was so common that it became part of the rhythm of daily life. Mothers kept it in their kitchens, fathers reached for it after long days, and even children were given drops when they cried too much. The idea that such a simple purchase could lead to destruction was far from people's minds. Pharmacies treated laudanum as an ordinary product. It was not sold under suspicion, but celebrated in advertisements. Newspapers filled with promises of its effectiveness, claiming it soothed every kind of discomfort, from headaches to stomach cramps. Doctors themselves often recommended it, using the authority of their profession to reassure families. In a time when medical knowledge was limited and pain relief was scarce, such claims were accepted without question. People trusted the advice given to them, and laudanum slipped into their homes as naturally as bread or coal. It sounds almost laughable that a drug mixing alcohol and opium could be sold so freely, but for Victorians, this was considered safe. The bottles themselves gave an impression of care. Brown glass suggested seriousness, and handwritten labels gave them a sense of tradition. Instructions were easy to follow: a spoonful at night, a few drops in tea, a small amount for restless children. The substance inside, however, was powerful and addictive, yet few people thought in those terms. Laudanum was treated as a cure-all, and cures were precious in a society where illness was constant and suffering was part of life. The danger was not hidden, but no one was looking for it. Every household kept it at hand, whether in a crowded working-class tenement or behind the heavy curtains of a wealthy townhouse. The poor bought small vials when they could, while the wealthy ordered larger bottles to be delivered with their other goods. It crossed class lines easily, binding the society together in a quiet dependency. For some, it was comfort, for others a necessity. Parents gave it to children so they could rest, and the elderly relied on it to make the nights pass. It became woven into daily routines until its presence was no longer questioned. If we compare this to today, it would be like finding bottles of liquid morphine mixed with alcohol on the shelves of every grocery store, sold without warnings and trusted as harmless. Advertisements fed this trust. Laudanum was called a gentle helper, a safe sedative, even a moral alternative to drunkenness. Articles praised its ability to calm nerves, to keep workers steady, and to protect women from hysteria. These messages repeated so often that the drug became invisible in its normality. If anyone spoke of side effects or strange illnesses, they were dismissed as rare accidents. It was easier to believe in safety than to accept danger. In a society used to constant risk, factories breaking bodies, cholera in the water, and smoke choking the air, the threat inside a medicine bottle felt small in comparison. What made laudanum terrifying was not a sudden shock, but its quiet acceptance. It was not bought in shadowy alleys but in daylight, from men in clean coats who carried respect. It did not start as vice but as trust. The danger lay in the very ordinariness of it. People thought they were following good advice, protecting their families and caring for themselves. The harm did not announce itself at first. It built slowly, hidden behind the appearance of medicine. I find it deeply unsettling to think that something so ordinary on a Victorian shelf was already the beginning of a tragedy. By the time doubts began to grow, laudanum had already rooted itself in households across the country. It was too familiar, too trusted, and too profitable to question. The first warnings were ignored, the early cases explained away, and the medicine continued to be poured into cups and spoons. Addiction was not a word people used, and dependence was not understood. They only saw a bottle that promised sleep, calm, and relief, and they believed it. In that trust was the beginning of countless private disasters. Laudanum entered homes as a trusted medicine, promising rest and relief for all. Yet that trust would soon turn into chains that families could not see. The harmless spoonfuls taken at night were the first quiet steps toward a much darker fate. Just a few drops of laudanum in the evening seemed harmless to almost everyone who used it. It was a small act, a detail in the flow of daily life that hardly drew attention. People poured a measure into tea or water, stirred, and drank without a second thought. They trusted it as a medicine, and treated it as something ordinary, like salt or sugar. In homes across Victorian towns, the same ritual repeated night after night. No one saw it as dangerous. They saw it as helpful, gentle, and easy. Mothers especially relied on those drops. When children cried for hours, when infants would not sleep, when the noise of the household became too much to bear, the answer often came from the small brown bottle. A teaspoon mixed into milk or warm water, and the child would soon grow quiet. The effect was quick, and the silence was welcome. Parents could finally rest, and siblings could finally sleep. The pattern became so common that few questioned it. The cries of children were softened not by comfort but by chemistry, though no one thought of it that way. It almost feels sarcastic to say that the normal sound of a baby's cry was treated as a problem to be solved with opium, yet this was exactly what happened. In middle-class parlours, the habit looked more refined. After dinner, while men smoked or drank, women added drops of laudanum to their tea. They did it calmly, as if it were a fashionable practice, part of a civilized routine. Guests might do the same, and no one raised an eyebrow. The action was small, repeated often, and quickly became a nightly expectation. To refuse it seemed unusual, even rude. The comfort it gave was praised. The unease it caused was invisible. People thought of it as balance, as a way to ease into the evening. They never imagined that such gestures could lead to dependence. The working classes used it too, though for different reasons. Factory workers returned home with aching limbs, throbbing headaches, and little money to spare. Laudanum was cheaper than a doctor and stronger than beer. A small dose dulled the pain and allowed them to keep moving the next day. Women who sewed for hours by candlelight used it to steady their hands and calm their nerves. Men who carried loads or stood by furnaces drank it to silence the constant ache. It was not luxury, but survival. A bottle of laudanum stretched farther than any medicine they could afford. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like poor families today reaching for a cheap bottle of liquid heroin at the local store, sold freely beside bread and milk. The danger lay not in the first drop but in the repetition. The body grew used to the taste and the effect. At first, one spoonful seemed enough. Then it required two. Then it required more. Nights without it became restless. Sleep would not come, and anxiety grew sharper. The hand reached for the bottle again and again, often without thought. What began as an occasional comfort became a necessity. Families did not see it as an addiction. They saw it as a habit, as a routine, as something they could not manage without. The line between need and desire blurred. Children grew up with it around them. Some tasted laudanum before they even learned to read. They drank it because their mothers told them it would help. They accepted it as naturally as they accepted bread or milk. Their bodies, smaller and weaker, absorbed the drug quickly. The silence that followed was taken as peace, but it was not peace. It was sedation. It was the start of a life shaped by chemicals, though no one recognized it that way. The next generation entered the same cycle before they even had a chance to choose otherwise. In wealthier homes, the use of laudanum was more discreet but no less frequent. Bottles were kept in drawers, tucked beside powders and perfumes. Women carried small vials in handbags or mixed drops into drinks at parties. The medicine was present in every social setting, even when unspoken. Men used it after heavy meals, adding it to wine or whiskey. It was not hidden from view, but it was not openly discussed either. Its presence was assumed, its dangers were denied. I find it unsettling to think of how entire households, from servants to masters, consume the same drug daily, each believing it was nothing more than a harmless support. The advertisements made the habit worse. Papers described laudanum as gentle, safe, and effective. They said it brought calm, prevented illness, and restored strength. Families read these words and trusted them. They bought more, gave more, and rarely asked questions. If a neighbour whispered of side effects, if a doctor hinted at danger, those warnings were drowned out by louder voices of reassurance. Commerce thrived on repetition, and the public absorbed the message. Laudanum was good. Laudanum was safe. Laudanum was necessary. Yet beneath this normality lay unease. Some began to notice trembling hands, dry mouths, restless nights, and odd behaviour. They whispered but did not confront. They explained it away as weakness or nervousness. It was easier to blame the person than the medicine. The habit was too widespread, too convenient, and too profitable to challenge. The few who saw the truth could do little against the tide of acceptance. Step by step, the harmless drops created dependence. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the hold was already too strong. Families could not imagine life without laudanum. Children had grown up with it. Adults required it, and the elderly clung to it. The society had tied itself to a drug while insisting it was medicine. That was the quiet danger. It did not suddenly destroy. It crept in slowly, silently, until there was no way back. It started with just a few drops added to tea or milk, trusted by parents and enjoyed by families. That small habit soon grew into a chain that bound entire households. Before long, the first cracks of sleeplessness, trembling, and confusion would begin to show. Within only a few months of regular use, the quiet routine of laudanum began to show its darker side. What had started as a spoonful in tea, a few drops in milk, or a nightly comfort became something different. The body adjusted quickly. The same amount that once gave rest now seemed useless. Sleep no longer came, calm no longer followed, and relief slipped further away. People discovered that more was needed, and then more again. What looked at first like a dependable helper became an endless chase. Those who tried to cut back found themselves trapped in discomfort. Nights became long and restless. Instead of drifting into sleep, they lay awake, tossing and turning, sweating under heavy blankets. Their hands trembled, their thoughts scattered, and every sound in the dark seemed louder than before. They reached for the bottle out of desperation, telling themselves it was only for a short while longer. Yet each night without it felt unbearable, and each day grew heavier with exhaustion. It is bitterly ironic that a medicine sold to cure sleeplessness so often became the very cause of it. Others leaned toward the opposite extreme. Rather than suffering through restless nights, they took larger doses. The effects were strange and frightening. Instead of clarity, the mind slipped into fog. Instead of rest, hours passed in a state of half-sleep, half-dream. Some described it as floating others as being trapped. They mumbled nonsense, spoke to people who were not there, and wandered through their homes in a daze. Families watched as loved ones lost their grip on ordinary life, though at the time they rarely connected it to the drops in the cup. The boundary between day and night soon dissolved. People slept through mornings, stared blankly through afternoons, and woke in the middle of the night as if it were noon. Clocks no longer mattered, and routines broke down. Work was neglected, meals were missed, and responsibilities were forgotten. The rhythm of daily life, once steady, was shattered by a drug that claimed to restore balance. If we compare this to today, it would be like taking a sleeping pill every evening only to find yourself wide awake at midnight, shaking with confusion and unable to tell whether you were meant to work, eat, or rest. The effect reached across all classes. A wealthy woman who once entertained guests at tea found herself avoiding company because she could not control her speech. Her words tangled into nonsense, and her friends slowly drifted away. A factory worker who had once relied on laudanum for pain now shook so badly he could barely hold tools. His fellow workers whispered about his condition, not understanding what had caused it. In both cases, shame followed. People tried to hide their weakness, afraid to be judged, and the bottles stayed close, tucked in drawers, pockets, or handbags. The physical changes were just as striking. Skin grew pale, eyes grew dark, and hands lost their steadiness. Even writing a letter became difficult. Some dropped utensils at the table, spilled cups of tea, or broke objects without meaning to. Their bodies betrayed them, and frustration turned to despair. Families noticed, but most chose silence. They pretended nothing was wrong, insisting that their loved one was simply tired, nervous, or unwell. Few dared to name the true cause, because to do so meant questioning a habit that seemed to hold the household together. I find it chilling to imagine how many people lived in this blurred state, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, moving through days that no longer had shape. Doctors rarely helped. Many prescribed even more laudanum, believing the symptoms were signs of illness rather than the effects of the drug itself. Others offered calming powders that contained the same ingredients under different names. Instead of relief, patients received deeper entanglement. The cycle tightened its grip. The same professionals who had recommended laudanum in the first place now deepened the dependence. Trust was betrayed, but in a quiet, almost invisible way. As dependence deepened, fear grew. Users feared the nights without laudanum, but they also feared the strange fog that came with higher doses. They were caught between two states, both unbearable. Families watched helplessly, unsure what to do. There were no clinics, no treatments, no understanding of withdrawal or tolerance. There was only the bottle, and the terrible choice between suffering without it or drifting into madness with it. Even the children who had been given laudanum from infancy began to show signs. They could not focus at school, they complained of headaches, and they struggled to stay awake. Teachers scolded them for laziness, not realizing the truth. The next generation grew under the same shadow as their parents, trapped in cycles that no one fully recognized. What had started as harmless care had become a legacy of dependence. Laudanum's spread was not dramatic but steady. No explosions, no sudden epidemics, just countless private stories of people losing track of themselves. It was a quiet collapse, one household at a time, hidden behind closed curtains and polite silence. The tragedy lay in its invisibility. The warning signs, trembling, sleeplessness, incoherent speech, were dismissed or ignored, and so the cycle continued unchecked. The early months of laudanum use were enough to destroy balance in lives that once seemed ordinary. Trust in a spoonful of liquid turned into a struggle between exhaustion and delirium. The price of comfort revealed itself in restless nights and trembling hands. Soon, what began as a simple solution would erode health and dignity even further. Families who once believed they were protecting themselves would learn how deeply the drug could corrode body and mind. The nightmare was only beginning, and the descent would grow darker from here. Laudanum began as a comfort but quickly twisted into a source of torment. People found themselves trapped between sleepless nights and fog-filled days. The line between healing and harm was gone, replaced by trembling hands and wandering minds. The next stage would show how even the wealthiest and most respected could not escape its grip. Among the upper classes of Victorian society, laudanum was as present as in the homes of the poor, though it appeared under different disguises. Women of wealth did not keep their bottles in plain view on kitchen shelves. Instead, they tucked them carefully into drawers, perfume boxes, or even the cases that held their powders and cosmetics. To anyone who looked, these items seemed like accessories of elegance. In truth, they often carried a dark secret. The ladies reached for them quietly, adding a few drops into tea or mixing them with sweet liquids to soften the bitter taste. The drug travelled with them to parlours, gardens, and even the theatre, hidden but never far from hand. It feels almost ridiculous that the same society that prided itself on refinement allowed its finest women to carry opium in perfume bottles as if it were a fashion accessory. Men of high rank were no less involved. At grand dinners, laudanum was mixed easily into whiskey or wine. Guests raised their glasses in toasts without realizing that the smooth burn of alcohol was laced with a stronger substance. Some added it openly, while others slipped it in quietly, treating it as a small indulgence rather than a serious choice. They called it tonic or a remedy, but it was more than that. The taste of laudanum became tied to moments of celebration and camaraderie. Soon, those moments demanded it. Nights without it felt incomplete. What had begun as an addition became a requirement, and no one at the long tables of polished oak seemed to notice. Afternoon teas carried the same pattern. In drawing rooms filled with light and chatter, teacups passed from hand to hand. Silver spoons stirred sugar and milk, and in many cases, a few hidden drops of laudanum. It was spoken of as a calming touch, a way to soften nerves and keep the gathering pleasant. Polite laughter and gentle conversation covered the growing dependence. Guests did not question one another, for they too carried the same secret. Each cup of tea became a quiet surrender, repeated day after day until it was no longer a choice but a reflex. If we compare this to today, it would be like finding respected executives and their spouses slipping narcotics into their coffee at every business meeting and calling it good manners. The wealth of the upper classes gave them more access to laudanum than most. They bought larger bottles, sometimes entire cases, and stored them away as carefully as they stored fine wines or imported teas. Servants who handled these purchases rarely questioned them, and when they did, they kept silent to protect their positions. The household revolved around appearances, and the appearance of control mattered more than the reality of health. Laudanum became part of the structure of elite life, a quiet thread running through every dinner, every gathering, every moment of leisure. Women in particular were vulnerable, encouraged to use laudanum for headaches, nervousness, or fatigue. Doctors often reinforced these habits, prescribing drops for every complaint, no matter how small. Husbands saw it as a solution to silence restless wives, and mothers saw it as a cure to calm themselves after long nights with children. The cycle built itself, wrapped in layers of respectability and denial. The wealthy did not see themselves as addicts. They saw themselves as refined, modern, and responsible. The bottles beside their perfumes were simply another tool of their lifestyle. The signs of dependence crept in slowly. A lady who once attended every ball with grace began to appear pale and tired. A gentleman who once spoke with confidence at meetings stumbled over his words, distracted and unfocused. Servants noticed trembling hands when pouring tea or holding pens, yet they spoke of nerves or exhaustion instead of laudanum. The silence around the drug was as strong as the drug itself. No one wanted to admit that the symbols of their refinement hid weakness. I cannot help but think how strange it is that the same society that condemned vice in the streets quietly accepted addiction in its own drawing rooms. At first, the effects did not stop life from moving forward. Balls were still held, dinners still served, and reputations still maintained. The difference was only visible in small moments. When a woman excused herself to her room, or when a man poured more into his glass than was usual. Behind closed doors, however, the dependence deepened. Servants were sent on errands more frequently. Bottles disappeared faster, and excuses became more creative. The cycle that had already consumed the poor now wrapped itself around those who claimed to be above them. The hypocrisy of it all was striking. The same nobles who judged the working class for drinking too much gin quietly filled their own cups with laudanum. They scolded the poor for weakness, while they themselves slipped into the same fog under the cover of etiquette and wealth. Respectability shielded them from criticism, but not from the truth of their condition. Addiction did not care for titles or incomes. It grew in every household that allowed laudanum through the door. The illusion of control was powerful. Nobles believed they could stop whenever they wished. They told themselves they were not like others, that their use was measured, that their bodies were stronger, yet night after night, the bottles emptied, the need grew. The sickness without it became unbearable. Still, they denied it, clinging to the belief that wealth and status made them immune. In reality, they were already caught in the same net as everyone else. The spread of laudanum in aristocratic circles showed how deep its reach had become. It was not only the poor in crowded streets who suffered, but also the wealthy behind high walls. The difference was that the poor were judged for it, while the rich were shielded by silence. The consequences, however, would not remain hidden forever. Even the most respected names would one day face the marks of dependence, and no amount of perfume or fine wine could disguise it. The aristocracy embraced laudanum without realizing its grip. They placed it in tea, in wine, in the very rituals that defined their class. They thought of it as sophistication, when in truth it was the same trap binding everyone else. Their wealth did not save them. Their refinement did not protect them. What they believed to be elegance was only the early stage of ruin. The deeper effects were yet to come, and soon the nights of quiet gatherings would turn into nights of restless despair. The wealthy treated laudanum as another ornament of their refined lives, but in doing so they blinded themselves to its dangers. Their homes filled with its presence just as the homes of the poor did. They simply wrapped their addiction in velvet and silver. Soon, the masks of control would slip away, revealing the same pale faces and trembling hands. What they could not hide was that laudanum spared no one, not even those who thought themselves untouchable. The decay of their world was beginning, and it would spread from their tea tables into their very beds. Laudanum in the aristocracy was never seen as an addiction, only as a refinement. They believed their wealth and respectability protected them, yet the drug eroded their bodies just the same. Behind the glitter of balls and the glow of chandeliers, dependence crept silently into their lives, and in the quiet hours of the night, when no one was watching, the illusion of safety crumbled. The nobility believed themselves immune, but laudanum made no distinction. Its grip held tightly, hidden in teacups and wine glasses. As the weeks turned into months, even their gilded homes could not shield them from its power. What they thought was control would soon reveal itself as surrender, and the elegant routines of aristocracy would give way to whispers of shame. They drank laudanum in tea and wine, they carried it in perfume cases, and they believed themselves refined rather than dependent. That illusion would not last forever. The same hands that held silver spoons would soon tremble in the night, and in the silence of their grand houses, the suffering would become impossible to hide. Nights without laudanum became long and merciless. The body, once calmed by a spoonful of the drug, now refused to rest without it. People lay awake in silence, turning from side to side, feeling every second drag on like an hour. The soft ticking of clocks grew unbearable. The the stillness of the room heavy like a weight pressing on the chest. What had once been ordinary sleep turned into an impossible task. The hours stretched endlessly, and with each passing moment, the craving grew sharper. Tears came often in those hours, in the privacy of bedrooms lined with velvet curtains and heavy drapes. Women and men cried quietly, their faces buried in pillows so no one would hear. It was not the loud weeping of grief, but a steady, muffled sobbing, born of exhaustion and despair. They wanted rest, but could not find it. They wanted peace, but could not escape the restlessness that consumed them. Even in homes filled with servants, no comfort came. No one entered the rooms. No one asked questions. The crying remained hidden, a secret between the sufferer and the silent walls. It is almost cruelly ironic that the rooms built for comfort and luxury became cages where people cried themselves through endless nights. The beds themselves became symbols of torment. Velvet spreads, feather pillows, and fine wooden frames could not disguise the truth. The bed was no longer a place of rest. It was a prison where hours of wakefulness and craving took hold. The body tossed, the hands trembled, the mind wandered into strange thoughts. Even closing the eyes brought no relief, for dreams slipped away and the brain refused to shut down. The same bed that once offered peace now felt like a trap that mocked its occupant. For the wealthy, this misery was carefully concealed. Servants might notice red eyes in the morning or hear faint sounds through the walls, but they said nothing. Appearances mattered more than reality. Families avoided speaking of it. Instead, they insisted that their loved one was simply tired or nervous. The truth was buried beneath silence, and the nightly suffering continued. In poor households, there was no luxury to hide behind. Yet the pattern was the same. Parents cried quietly while children slept, their bodies shaking in beds that were little more than straw and cloth. The desperation was universal, crossing class boundaries with ease. The nights grew longer as the drug demanded more. Without laudanum, sleep vanished. With too much of it, dreams turned to nightmares, filled with shadows and strange voices. Neither state gave comfort. People woke in the dark with a dry mouth, a pounding heart, and trembling hands. They reached for bottles in desperation, sometimes drinking directly from the glass, sometimes spilling in their hurry. The relief was only temporary. By dawn, the craving returned. The cycle had no end. If we compare this to today, it would be like seeing entire families unable to sleep unless they had a narcotic beside their bed, treating it as naturally as a glass of water. The loneliness of those nights was profound. Even in houses full of people, the sufferer was alone. No one spoke of what was happening. Husbands turned away, wives kept silent, and children never knew. Servants pretended not to hear. Every tear fell unseen, every sob unheard. The isolation was perhaps worse than the craving itself. To suffer in silence, to know that no one would acknowledge the struggle, was a burden few could bear. I find it disturbing to imagine how many people cried themselves into exhaustion in beds that looked soft and warm but felt like cages of despair. Some tried to distract themselves. They read by candlelight, though their hands shook so badly that the pages rattled. They prayed quietly, but the words lost meaning in the fog of exhaustion. Others paced the room, leaving marks in the carpet from repeated steps. Yet no distraction worked for long. The craving always returned, gnawing at them until the only choice was to take more laudanum. The cycle reinforced itself with every sleepless night, tightening the grip of dependence. The signs became visible over time. Sunken eyes, pale skin, and hollow cheeks betrayed the long hours without rest. Friends and family noticed, yet most refused to speak. They invented explanations: nervous disposition, weak constitution, or simple fatigue. Anything was easier than admitting the truth. To acknowledge laudanum as the cause meant acknowledging their own complicity in its use. Silence was safer, and so the nights of torment continued behind closed doors. The quiet tears in those rooms never appeared in newspapers or medical journals. They left no record, no testimony, no public scandal. Yet they shaped the daily lives of countless families. The drug promised sleep but stole it away. It promised comfort but replaced it with endless restlessness. The velvet-lined beds became sites of silent battles, repeated night after night, with no one to witness and no one to help. These nights were not just episodes of insomnia. They were the early stages of collapse. The body, denied natural rest, began to weaken. The mind, deprived of clarity, slipped into confusion. The spirit, weighed down by despair, crumbled. What seemed at first like a harmless aid to sleep had now turned bedrooms into places of quiet misery. Behind every curtain, in every home, someone lay awake, crying into pillows, desperate for relief that never came. Laudanum turned night into torment. The absence of the drug brought hours of restlessness and tears. The presence of it brought nightmares and confusion. Either way, the bed became a prison and the nights a punishment. What families believed would give peace had instead created despair. The silence of those rooms was heavy with suffering that no one dared to speak aloud. The sleepless nights revealed the true power of laudanum. It did not simply ease pain, it controlled lives, erasing the difference between comfort and captivity. Those who once trusted it now found themselves trapped in a cycle of craving and despair. And as the nights dragged on, the drug began to carve its marks into their bodies for all to see. Nights without laudanum ended in tears and trembling, and nights with it ended in nightmares and fog. The velvet beds turned into prisons, and the silence of crying went unheard. Soon, the toll would grow more visible as the drug began to change faces and bodies in ways that could no longer be ignored. The changes to the body came slowly at first, then all at once. Those who had once looked healthy began to pale. Their skin lost its colour, turning sallow and thin. What had been lively eyes dulled until they seemed empty, staring at nothing, reflecting only exhaustion. People who once carried themselves with strength now looked fragile, as if a small wind could knock them down. Families noticed but often turned away. To speak of it meant to admit that laudanum was not helping but harming. Silence became easier, even as the signs grew impossible to ignore. Faces grew gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath thinning skin. The glow of youth disappeared, replaced by a hollow expression that no powders or perfumes could disguise. Hair fell out in clumps, leaving patches that no fashionable bonnet could cover. Friends who once greeted with warmth now hesitated, unsettled by the sight. Whispers spread quietly, blaming stress, illness, or weakness, but few admitted the truth. It almost feels sarcastic to think that society, obsessed with appearance, ignored the fact that their beauty routines hid bottles of opium, destroying those very appearances. The body no longer asked for food, hunger dulled, replaced by the constant craving for the drug. Meals went untouched, plates sat half full, and weight dropped with alarming speed. Clothes hung loose, rings slipped from fingers, and belts tightened notch after notch. The proud posture of once healthy men and women collapsed into stooped frames, fragile and unsteady. What families thought was elegance turned into frailty, and what they excused as fatigue was really the body wasting away. Hands shook uncontrollably. Writing letters became impossible. Cups rattled against saucers, and pens slipped from trembling fingers. Simple tasks became battles. Knitting, sewing, or even holding a book felt overwhelming. People avoided social gatherings, embarrassed by their loss of control. They withdrew from the world, choosing to remain in rooms where their weakness could stay hidden. In truth, the drug had already eaten away at their dignity. The symptoms spread beyond the physical. Dry mouth made speaking uncomfortable, and conversations faltered. Breath smelled faintly of medicine and alcohol, further alienating those around them. The body, once kept strong by regular food and activity, now depended solely on the next dose. Families who had once gathered around the dinner table sat in silence, the presence of laudanum pressing down heavier than the weight of hunger. If we compare this to today, it would be like watching someone slowly starve themselves while insisting that their daily shot of narcotics is all they need to survive. Servants often saw the truth more clearly than family. They washed the linen stained by sweat, carried away untouched plates, and noticed the bottles piling up in drawers, yet they rarely spoke. To do so risked their positions. They remained quiet, helping where they could, but always complicit in maintaining the illusion. In wealthier homes, the silence was heavier, for reputation meant everything. It was better to ignore the pale skin and trembling hands than to face the shame of public knowledge. The effects on relationships were devastating. Friends stopped calling, frightened by the changes they could not understand. Relatives invented excuses to avoid visiting. Those who remained close often felt powerless, trapped between concern and denial. To watch a loved one crumble before their eyes was unbearable, yet to intervene risked breaking the fragile social rules that demanded silence. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how many people wasted away behind curtains, abandoned by those who once cared for them, left alone with only their bottles and their fear. The visible decay made it harder to pretend that everything was fine. Society could no longer hide the truth behind polite manners or elegant clothing. The marks of laudanum were etched into faces, bodies, and movements. The pale skin, the hollow eyes, the thinning hair, these became the signs of a life consumed. Still, denial persisted. The blame fell on nerves, weak constitution, or even imagination. Anything was better than admitting that the trusted medicine had become a destroyer. For those trapped in the cycle, shame added to suffering. They knew their appearance had changed. They saw the way others looked at them, or the way others avoided looking at all. Mirrors became unbearable, meals meaningless, and writing a letter impossible. They lived in a body they no longer recognized, chained by a drug they once thought was a friend. The more their health faded, the stronger their need grew. Escape seemed impossible, and hope slipped further away. The slow erosion of body and mind revealed the true nature of laudanum. It was not medicine, but a slow poison, robbing people of strength, dignity, and connection. Its grip was not sudden, but relentless, wearing away at every part of life until nothing was left but dependence. Families watched, neighbours whispered, and society turned its head. All the while, the victims withered in silence, betrayed by the very cure they trusted. Laudanum had promised relief, but delivered ruin. It replaced healthy flesh with bone, clear eyes with emptiness, steady hands with tremors. The transformation was undeniable, yet still many clung to denial. To admit the truth meant to face the scale of the problem, and that was more frightening than silence. So the cycle continued, and the bodies continued to fade. The pale faces, empty eyes, and trembling hands were no longer hidden. They marked every user, no matter their class or wealth. What began as a simple remedy had now carved its destruction into skin and bone. Families who once believed in healing now faced a decay they could not stop, and soon the transformation of the body would lead to the slow destruction of identity itself. They became pale shadows of themselves, wasting away while the world looked on in silence. Their beauty, strength, and dignity vanished under the drug's weight. What laudanum took from the body, it would soon begin to take from the mind. The next stage of the descent would leave not only fragile bodies but empty shells where once there were whole people. Women who had once walked proudly into grand ballrooms began to disappear from public life. These were the same ladies whose gowns shimmered under chandeliers, who drew admiration with their grace and charm, and who were invited to the most celebrated gatherings of the season. Now they lay curled in their beds, unable or unwilling to leave their rooms. The velvet curtains stayed closed. the music and laughter of the outside world muffled to silence. Their once vibrant lives shrank to the narrow space of a chamber, the bed transforming into both refuge and prison. The shift was startling, though it happened quietly enough that society rarely spoke of it aloud. Servants knew the truth, though they were instructed never to speak of it. They saw the trembling hands and the pale faces. They carried trays of untouched meals back to the kitchen, bottles hidden under linen, and clothing that no longer fit wasted bodies. Their orders were clear: do not mention the condition of the mistress. Keep the secret, protect the family's name, and never allow outsiders to guess the truth. Silence was their duty, and so the suffering was hidden even within the household itself. It is almost laughable, in the darkest sense, that servants were told to ignore the obvious, as if turning away from a problem could make it vanish. For the families, shame soon replaced sympathy. At first, there were visits, words of concern, and gifts meant to cheer. As the illness deepened and the truth grew harder to hide, relatives began to distance themselves. A woman who had once been the centre of attention became an embarrassment. Invitations stopped arriving, letters went unanswered, and her name was quietly omitted from conversations. Families who prized their reputations decided it was easier to cut ties than to confront the disgrace of addiction. The transformation was cruel. The woman who had been admired for elegance and beauty became a figure hidden from sight. Her fine gowns hung unworn in closets, her jewellery remained locked away, and the mirror reflected a stranger she could barely recognise. The friends who had once flattered her now crossed the street to avoid her family. The social world she once thrived in erased her presence, as though she had never belonged to it at all. For many of these women, isolation only deepened the grip of laudanum. With no place to go and no company to keep, the bottle became both comfort and companion. They lay in bed for hours, drifting between restless sleep and foggy wakefulness, their bodies weakened by hunger and neglect. The home that had once been filled with light and conversation grew quiet, its halls echoing with absence. In such houses, silence became a language, a way to pretend nothing was wrong while everything was falling apart. If we compare this to today, it would be like watching a respected public figure vanish from events and parties, retreating into a locked bedroom, while everyone whispers but no one dares to say the word addiction. The servants carried on their duties with quiet obedience, dusting rooms that their mistress no longer entered, preparing meals that would not be eaten. They saw the once radiant figure become frail, wrapped in blankets, her eyes empty and unfocused. Some pitied her, some resented the burden, but all followed the unspoken rule of silence. To speak of it risked dismissal, and so the truth remained locked behind closed doors. The women themselves sometimes tried to fight back. They attempted to dress, to put on makeup, to join family dinners, but the trembling hands betrayed them. The pale skin revealed them, and the empty eyes told a story no amount of powder could hide. After repeated attempts, most gave up. They stayed in their beds, hidden from view, convinced they no longer belonged to the world outside. The families carried their shame like a shadow. Neighbours noticed the absence, whispered about illness or nerves, and gossiped about what had really happened. The truth was often close, but polite society avoided naming it. To say laudanum was to break the illusion of control and refinement that the upper classes held so dearly. Better to invent explanations than to admit that their wives, daughters, or sisters had been consumed by a drug everyone once called medicine. I cannot help but feel uneasy imagining how many women were abandoned in this way, hidden in fine houses, forgotten by friends, and left only with their bottles. This fall from grace revealed the fragility of status. Elegance and wealth provided no protection. The same society that had raised these women onto pedestals quickly turned away when weakness appeared. In silence, they became shadows of themselves, wandering only in the confines of their rooms, drifting further from life with each passing day. The transformation from celebrated hostess to hidden invalid was not a sudden collapse but a gradual erasure. One missed ball, one refused invitation, one unanswered letter, and soon the world outside forgot. Behind closed doors, the woman lay trapped, her life reduced to the cycle of craving and despair. She was no longer a presence in society, but an absence, remembered only in whispers and half-forgotten stories. The quiet decline of these once-admired women was a reminder that laudanum did not respect wealth or class. It consumed its victims slowly, stripping away dignity, isolating them from loved ones, and turning fine houses into prisons. For every glittering ballroom, there were countless bedrooms where women cried silently, their bodies weakened and their minds clouded, erased from the world they had once commanded. They were once celebrated, admired, and respected, yet laudanum reduced them to fragile figures hidden away. Servants kept the secret, families withdrew in shame, and society erased their names. What began as grace and refinement ended as loneliness and despair, and the world they had known moved on without them. Soon, the walls of their bedrooms would hide not only their tears but also the tools of their dependence, locked away in silence. They went from queens of society to forgotten shadows, hidden in their own homes. Families turned their backs, servants kept quiet, and society looked the other way. But the bottles in the drawers remained, feeding the decline, preparing the stage for even darker secrets to be hidden inside those grand houses. The bedrooms of those caught by laudanum soon became places of secrecy. Curtains were drawn tightly, blocking the light of day and the eyes of outsiders. Heavy fabric hung unmoving, shutting out the world and keeping the room in permanent shadow. Visitors were no longer welcome inside. Doors stayed locked, and hallways grew quiet. The once lively spaces where family gathered or where guests were entertained turned into silent chambers of retreat. The drug that had promised rest and relief had now demanded concealment. The bottles themselves were rarely left in the open. They were hidden carefully in drawers, locked boxes, or small cases kept under pillows. Families pretended not to know, though many understood exactly what was happening. Only the most trusted servants were allowed to enter, carrying fresh linens or small meals, never asking questions about what else they saw. Their duties included keeping the secret, wiping sweat from a pale face, or holding a basin when nausea struck. The drug sat in its hiding places, always within reach, yet always out of sight. It feels almost absurd that households that prided themselves on order and morality kept their darkest secret tucked neatly away in locked drawers. The rooms themselves reflected the secrecy. Air grew stale behind the curtains, the smell of medicine clinging to the sheets. Beds went unmade, tables filled with cups, spoons, and cloths left from restless nights. The outside world no longer entered, letters piled up unanswered, invitations left unopened, and even family members stopped knocking. What happened within those four walls was spoken of only in whispers, if at all. In these hidden chambers, the rhythm of life was controlled entirely by the drug. Days blurred into nights, marked only by doses taken and bottles emptied. The quiet was broken by moments of sobbing, the rattle of trembling hands against porcelain, or the faint sound of a servant moving carefully across the floor. Yet the house carried on as if nothing was wrong. The halls were kept clean, meals were served, and visitors were greeted politely in other rooms, while behind one closed door, dependence grew stronger. For the person inside, the room became the entire world. The curtains cut off sunlight, the door cut off voices, and the drawer with its hidden bottles became the centre of existence. The mind drifted in and out of fog, and the body weakened further with each passing day. Attempts to stop were quickly abandoned when sleepless nights returned. The prison of velvet curtains and locked drawers became too powerful to escape. If we compare this to today, it would be like seeing someone live entirely in a darkened room with their supply of narcotics kept in a bedside safe. the outside world reduced to whispers through the walls. The servants who were allowed inside carried their own burden. They saw their mistress or master wasting away, yet could do nothing. They changed undergarments, wiped faces, and brought trays that returned untouched. Their silence was demanded not only by duty but by fear of losing their place in the household. The unspoken rule was clear: keep the secret at all costs. Some pitied their employers, others resented them, but all were trapped in the same cycle of silence. Families rarely spoke of what was happening. To mention it aloud risked scandal. They preferred to act as though their loved one was merely ill, confined to bed by nerves or weakness. When guests asked, polite excuses were given. No one admitted the truth. The shame of addiction was too heavy to acknowledge. It was easier to keep the curtains closed and the doors locked, to let the secret rot in silence rather than confront it. I find it unsettling to think how many grand houses, polished on the outside, hid such dark misery in their bedrooms, where secrets festered while reputations were protected. The isolation fed the addiction further, with no one to stop them and no responsibilities to meet. People consumed laudanum freely. They convinced themselves it was medicine, that it was needed to keep the pain away, that it was temporary. Yet the bottles emptied faster, the hidden drawers filled with empties, and the cycle deepened. The very secrecy that protected them from shame also chained them more tightly to the drug. These rooms, once places of rest and privacy, became tombs of the living. Curtains blocked light, doors blocked voices, and families blocked the truth. Behind those walls, people wasted away in silence, watched only by servants who dared not speak. The wealth and refinement that decorated those houses meant nothing within the darkened rooms where laudanum ruled every moment. The hidden bedrooms told a story of denial. Addiction was not faced, it was concealed. Dependence was not treated, it was locked away. The drug consumed the body and spirit while families looked the other way. The silence of those rooms echoed louder than any confession could have, a silence built from fear, shame, and the desperate need to preserve appearances. They turned their bedrooms into prisons, hiding bottles in locked drawers and keeping curtains closed to the world. Families pretended not to see. Servants kept the secret, and reputations mattered more than truth. But the cost of hiding could not last forever. The very walls that concealed their suffering would one day hide their deaths. The hidden rooms grew darker as the drug's grip tightened, and every curtain drawn shut was another sign of defeat. They believed secrecy protected them, but it only deepened their chains. Soon, some of those locked rooms would hold bodies rather than secrets, discovered too late behind closed doors. Some deaths came quietly, without warning and without witnesses. A person took more laudanum than usual, perhaps just a few drops extra, perhaps a careless measure poured into a cup. The effect was swift. Instead of drifting into uneasy sleep, the body slipped too far. Breathing slowed, the heart weakened, and within hours, life was gone. No cries, no struggle, only stillness under the heavy curtains of the bedroom. To the family outside, it looked like rest. The door stayed closed, the house remained silent, and no one knew the truth until much later. Relatives often assumed their loved one was simply sleeping. Laudanum was known to bring long periods of rest, so a locked door or a still figure under blankets raised little suspicion. Days could pass without question. Servants carried food to the door but left quietly when there was no answer. Families convinced themselves that rest was needed and did not intrude. By the time someone finally entered, the air was cold, the body unresponsive, and the bottle nearby empty. The shock was great, but the surprise was not always spoken aloud. It almost feels cruelly absurd that families mistook death itself for the very sleep they had once prayed the drug would bring. The discovery was often grim. Curtains were drawn tight, the room stale, and the figure on the bed unnaturally still. Bottles lay empty beside cups or on bedside tables. In some cases, a hand still held the glass. Those who entered found not a patient but a corpse. Yet even then, the truth was hidden. To speak of laudanum as the cause was to invite scandal. Instead, families and doctors used gentler words. Official records listed death as natural, as heart failure, or as weakness. The drug itself was rarely mentioned. This silence extended beyond individual homes. Newspapers did not print the truth. Instead, they reported sudden deaths with vague explanations. The public never saw the connection between laudanum and the rising number of unexplained deaths. Doctors argued quietly, but no strong regulation followed. Pharmacies continued to sell freely, and families continued to buy. The cycle of trust and denial ensured that more deaths would follow, each hidden behind polite phrases. If we compare this to today, it would be like calling an overdose a fainting spell, recording it as exhaustion, and pretending the needle or pill bottle beside the body did not exist. The victims came from every class. Wealthy women, once celebrated in ballrooms, were found lifeless in their beds, their families whispering about nerves or illness. Poor workers collapsed in small rented rooms, their deaths unnoticed until neighbours complained of the smell. In both cases, laudanum stood nearby, silent and empty. Yet no distinction was made between accidental overdose and natural decline. The shame of naming the drug outweighed the truth of its danger. Servants carried the heaviest part of this silence. They were often the first to discover the bodies, entering to clean or bring food. They saw the empty bottles, the still hands, the pale faces, but they said nothing beyond what was instructed. Families demanded silence, and servants obeyed. To them, it was another duty, another secret kept in exchange for their place in the household. They lived with the knowledge of what had happened, but could never speak of it openly. The tragedy of these quiet deaths lay in their invisibility. Each one was dismissed, explained away, or erased from memory. The drug continued to be trusted because its true cost remained unspoken. Families grieved privately, avoided scandal, and returned to their routines. Pharmacies profited, newspapers ignored, and society pretended. Meanwhile, more people poured too much into cups, swallowed too many drops, and never woke again. I cannot help but feel unsettled by how many lives ended in silence, with death mistaken for sleep and truth buried under polite lies. The numbers grew, but the awareness did not. Each death was seen as an isolated tragedy, not part of a larger pattern. Without acknowledgement, nothing changed. The poor kept buying small bottles, the rich kept hiding vials in drawers, and doctors kept writing prescriptions. The cycle turned endlessly, leaving behind beds where bodies grew cold under velvet covers or thin sheets alike. For the addicted, the danger of overdose was constant. Their bodies demanded more, their tolerance grew, and the line between enough and too much blurred. One night of desperation, one careless measure, and the end came swiftly. Families told themselves it was fate, weakness, or sudden illness. They rarely admitted that it was the drug they themselves had handed across the table. Laudanum's promise of rest became its deadliest lie. It lured people with the hope of sleep and then delivered stillness of a different kind. The velvet-lined bedrooms of the wealthy and the damp rented rooms of the poor alike became silent tombs. The only witnesses were empty bottles and locked doors. The world outside remained unaware, content to accept the polite words written in records and the silence that followed. They thought the drug brought rest, but it often brought death. Families mistook corpses for sleepers, doctors called poison natural, and society turned away. Yet behind every closed curtain lay the same truth. Laudanum had claimed another life, and as long as silence prevailed, more bodies would be found, still and cold, in the very beds where they once sought comfort. The quiet deaths hidden behind curtains revealed how dangerous laudanum had become. Families refused to name it, society refused to see it, and so the cycle continued. But with each life lost, fear began to grow, spreading slowly from home to home. Soon, the unease would no longer stay confined to bedrooms, and whispers of danger would echo into the wider world. As deaths and strange illnesses mounted, unease began to spread beyond the walls of private homes. People whispered of sudden losses, of friends who had wasted away, of relatives who had never woken from sleep. Yet those whispers rarely turned into open conversations. Fear moved quietly through the streets, carried in glances and half-spoken remarks, but it was never fully voiced. To admit the truth meant confronting not only the drug itself, but also the trust that society had placed in it. Instead, a strange silence hung over the growing panic. From time to time, newspapers attempted to report on the matter. Small columns spoke of unexplained deaths or warned of excessive use. Doctors were quoted, neighbours told their stories, and suspicions pointed to the familiar bottles of laudanum. Yet these reports rarely lasted. Pressure from pharmacies, advertisers, or even local officials ensured that articles were pulled, retractions printed, or stories buried in later editions. The truth could not be allowed to gain momentum. Commerce demanded silence, and public fear was smothered before it grew too loud. It is almost darkly amusing that newspapers that freely described murders and scandals hesitated to mention a drug quietly killing hundreds in plain sight. The medical profession itself was divided. Some doctors praised laudanum as one of the greatest tools of their practice, a medicine that eased pain, calmed nerves, and soothed restless children. They prescribed it freely, defending it against criticism and blaming misuse for its dangers. Others began to warn of its risks, speaking of patients who wasted away, of symptoms that could not be explained by any illness except dependence. Their warnings, however, were dismissed by many colleagues and drowned out by the louder voices of profit. Without consensus, the public remained confused, torn between trust and suspicion. Pharmacies continued to sell without restriction. Bottles lined their shelves, available to anyone with coins to pay. There were no regulations, no limits on quantity, and no questions asked. A mother could buy enough laudanum to dose her entire household, and a worker could purchase a vial on his way home from the factory. The transactions were quick and ordinary, treated no differently than the sale of bread or matches. The system profited, and so it refused to change. If we compare this to today, it would be like walking into a corner store and finding bottles of morphine-based syrup stacked beside soda, advertised as safe and sold without oversight. The fear in society was complicated. On one hand, people began to suspect the drug. They whispered about the strange symptoms they saw in their neighbours, about the families that suddenly withdrew from public life. On the other hand, many continued to use it themselves. To accept the danger meant to question their own habits, and that was too frightening. It was easier to believe the comforting words of advertisements than the warnings whispered in back alleys. The silence around laudanum was reinforced by shame. Families did not want to admit that their loved ones were dependent. Admitting the truth meant exposing themselves to gossip, ridicule, or disgrace. Better to call it nerves, weakness, or a hidden illness than to say the word addiction. Society turned its face away, allowing the problem to fester. In drawing rooms and taverns alike, people avoided the subject, even as laudanum continued to shape their lives. I find it deeply troubling to imagine how fear could spread so widely, yet remain unspoken. A secret everyone knew, but no one dared to name. The contradictions were everywhere. Deaths rose, yet bottles sold more than ever. Doctors argued, yet the public bought without hesitation. Newspapers whispered warnings, yet the same pages carried advertisements praising the drug. The unease of the people was swallowed by the silence of authority. No one wanted to take responsibility, and so the problem grew in the shadows. The quiet panic revealed the power of denial. People were afraid, but fear was not enough to spark change. Instead, they continued their habits, telling themselves that the problem belonged to others. As long as no one admitted the truth, society could carry on as if nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, trust had already begun to fracture. The very foundations of medicine, family, and commerce trembled under the weight of suspicion. The spread of laudanum's dangers was no longer just a private tragedy. It had become a public crisis, visible to anyone willing to look. Yet the response was silence, denial, and continued profit. The drug remained in every home, every pharmacy, and every newspaper advertisement. The whispers of fear grew louder, but they were still whispers. Laudanum turned society into a place of contradictions. Fear spread, yet silence prevailed. Warnings appeared, yet they vanished. Doctors disagreed, yet bottles sold without pause. The public knew, yet refused to admit. The result was a growing panic hidden beneath polite conversation, a fear too great to face but too obvious to ignore. People feared laudanum but continued to buy it. Doctors argued but offered no solution. Pharmacies profited while newspapers erased the truth. The silence that followed each death grew heavier, and the whispers that spread through the streets carried a truth no one dared to speak. Soon, the cost of this silence would not only be seen in wasted lives but also in the generations yet to come. The effects of laudanum did not end with those who consumed it. The damage reached into the next generation, carried quietly through the bodies of mothers who depended on the drug. Many children were born weak, their small frames fragile before life had even begun. Some could not cry properly, their voices thin, strained, or absent altogether. Families looked at them with worry, unsure why their newborns seemed different. They blamed fate, poor health, or misfortune, rarely considering that the small bottles kept in bedside drawers had played a role. Mothers who had relied on laudanum throughout pregnancy believed they were protecting themselves. Doctors had assured them it was safe, a remedy for nerves, sleeplessness, and pain. Women were encouraged to take it to remain calm, to keep themselves composed during difficult months. Few realized that the drug also reached their unborn children, shaping bodies and minds before they had a chance to live freely. The results appeared in delivery rooms, where babies entered the world already marked by the substance their mothers trusted. It is almost cruelly ironic that the medicine praised for calming mothers was quietly stealing the strength of the children they carried. As these children grew, the consequences became more obvious. They struggled with weakness, frequent illnesses, and delayed development. Some were smaller than their peers, unable to keep up in play or work. Others grew pale and sickly, always needing rest, never thriving. In households where laudanum remained present, children were sometimes given the drug directly, continuing the cycle that began before their birth. A generation was raised in the shadow of addiction, their lives shaped by choices made long before they could decide for themselves. The silence around the issue made it worse. Society did not speak of the risks. Families avoided the subject, ashamed to admit the truth. Doctors rarely acknowledged the link, preferring to blame weak constitutions or hereditary flaws. Mothers carried guilt without answers, watching their children struggle while still reaching for the bottles themselves. The secrecy ensured that nothing changed, and the cycle repeated. If we compare this to today, it would be like allowing pregnant women to drink freely from bottles of strong narcotics sold in grocery stores, while everyone insisted it was harmless and refused to discuss the consequences. Children raised in these environments grew up surrounded by laudanum. They saw the bottles on tables, heard the clink of spoons in cups, and watched as their parents relied on doses to get through each day. For them, dependence was normal. Some began consuming the drug themselves at an early age, encouraged by parents who believed it was medicine. Others suffered simply by being around it, absorbing the effects of a home defined by silence and secrecy. The drug became part of their upbringing, shaping not only their health, but also their understanding of family life. The tragedy deepened when schools and communities noticed but did nothing. Teachers scolded children for being lazy, inattentive, or weak, without realizing the truth. Neighbors whispered about families with sickly children but avoided confronting them. The subject remained taboo, hidden behind closed doors and polite conversation. Generations were raised in silence, carrying forward the consequences of a problem no one would name. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how many children suffered before they had any chance to choose, their lives shaped by bottles they never held. The wealthy were not spared. In grand homes, infants were quieted with drops of laudanum, and mothers were praised for keeping their households calm. These children often grew pale and frail, yet their families insisted it was simply a sign of delicate health. In poor neighbourhoods, children wasted away with no one to protect them. Their cries went unheard, their weakness dismissed, their deaths recorded as natural misfortune. Across all classes, the pattern was the same. The drug touched every cradle, leaving behind a trail of fragile lives. The lack of education about the dangers ensured that nothing changed. There were no warnings, no campaigns, no rules to prevent pregnant women from taking laudanum or giving it to their children. The knowledge that might have saved lives remained hidden. Instead, the silence of shame and denial continued, leaving each generation to repeat the mistakes of the one before. This legacy of addiction reached deep into society. It was not only individuals who suffered, but entire families, entire communities, and entire generations. The drug shaped lives from the very beginning, carving weakness and dependence into the bones of children before they had even spoken their first words. And yet, society looked away, unwilling to confront the truth of what was happening in homes across the country. Laudanum was not only a curse of the present, but a shadow over the future. Its effects passed quietly from mothers to children, from one generation to the next. The silence that surrounded it ensured that the cycle continued, unchecked and unchallenged. The children who grew up in its shadow became adults who repeated the same patterns, handing down not only the bottles but also the silence. Families grieved for weak children, blamed fate, and kept pouring drops into cups. Doctors avoided the subject, newspapers stayed quiet, and society allowed the suffering to continue. The cost of silence was written into the bodies of children who never had a chance. Soon, the drug would reveal even darker effects, as those born into its shadow began to see things no one else could. The children were born fragile, raised in silence, and shaped by addiction they did not choose. Their weakness was explained away, their struggles ignored, and their futures cut short. But the next stage of laudanum's curse would not remain hidden behind shame or silence. It would emerge in terrifying visions that blurred the line between life and nightmare. Hallucinations began to creep into the lives of those who had long depended on laudanum. At first, it was small, a shadow in the corner of the room, a faint sound beneath the floorboards, or the feeling that someone was standing just behind them. These moments were dismissed as tricks of exhaustion or nerves, but over time they grew stronger, more terrifying, and impossible to ignore. The drug that had once promised peace now opened doors to visions that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Some believed they were being chased. In the middle of the night, a sudden panic would strike, and they would run across their rooms, convinced unseen figures were closing in. Windows that were once admired for their fine curtains and polished glass became escape routes. A few threw themselves out in terror, certain they were fleeing attackers. Families found them broken and bleeding, but even then, the truth was covered with silence. It is almost grimly absurd that a medicine sold for calm could drive people to leap from windows in desperate attempts to escape imaginary threats. Others turned to writing, filling diaries with frantic notes about creatures crawling under their beds, or voices whispering from beneath the floorboards. The words were scattered, incoherent, and desperate. Pages described insects with human faces, demons tugging at sheets, or shadows crawling across walls. These journals, often hidden away by families, offered a rare glimpse into the torment of minds overtaken by laudanum. What might have been dismissed as fantasy was, for them, a living reality. Food, once a source of comfort, became another battlefield. Some believed their meals were poisoned. They pushed plates away, refused to drink, and wasted further into weakness. To them, the bitter taste of laudanum was safer than bread or broth. They trusted the drug, but distrusted everything else. The paranoia deepened the dependence, trapping them in a cycle that destroyed both body and mind. If we compare this to today, it would be like watching someone reject every meal their family offers while clinging to a bottle of narcotics as their only source of safety. Servants who witnessed these episodes kept silent but carried heavy burdens. They were the ones who found broken bodies after a leap from a window, or who cleaned spilled ink from diaries filled with nonsense. They whispered to one another in kitchens but never spoke openly. Knowing their jobs depended on silence, families demanded secrecy, and servants obeyed. The hallucinations remained hidden behind closed doors, another secret wrapped in shame. The victims themselves rarely understood what was happening. To them, the visions were real. They lived in a world where demons clawed at walls, where voices whispered from the ground, and where neighbours plotted to poison them. Reality bent under the weight of the drug, and every moment of clarity was soon drowned by another dose. They could not escape, for the very substance that created the visions was the same one they believed they needed to survive. I find it unsettling to imagine these people living in constant terror, convinced of threats that existed only in their minds, yet still trusted by their families as simply ill. Doctors often made matters worse. Instead of recognizing the signs of addiction, they prescribed more laudanum or other sedatives. Patients were told to take another dose to calm their nerves, to ease their fears, or to help them sleep. The result was predictable. The hallucinations grew sharper, the paranoia stronger, and the dependence deeper. The same drug that caused the visions was offered as the cure, and so the cycle never ended. For families, the shame was immense. Relatives avoided speaking of the strange behaviour, preferring to call it hysteria, nerves, or weakness of mind. To admit the truth meant admitting that the trusted medicine had destroyed their loved ones. Instead, they locked doors, closed curtains, and told neighbours polite lies. The truth remained trapped inside the rooms, hidden alongside the trembling hands and terrified eyes of those who could no longer distinguish real from imagined. The hallucinations stripped away the last traces of dignity. A woman who had once hosted elegant dinners now screamed at shadows in her bedroom. A man who had once commanded respect at meetings now muttered about voices under the floor. These transformations were devastating, but they were rarely spoken of. Families preferred silence to scandal, leaving the victims alone with their nightmares. The deeper the visions grew, the more isolated the sufferers became. Friends stopped visiting, relatives turned away, and even servants entered rooms with caution. The hallucinations created a prison more terrifying than sleeplessness or trembling hands. It was a world where every shadow threatened, every whisper accused, and every moment stretched into horror. There was no peace, only fear, and the drug that caused it sat waiting in locked drawers. The spread of hallucinations marked a new stage in the descent of laudanum users. It was no longer just the body that withered, but the mind that fractured. Those who had once sought calm now found themselves living in terror. Their families hid the truth, their doctors fed the problem, and society ignored the signs. Behind closed doors, laudanum turned bedrooms into places of horror, and victims into shadows haunted by their own visions. They thought laudanum would calm them, but it filled their nights with demons and voices. They trusted it for safety, but it convinced them that even their food was poisoned. What began as a cure now shattered their minds, leaving them lost in fear, and soon society would dismiss their cries as nothing more than weakness, deepening the tragedy. Every cry for help from women trapped in laudanum's grip was dismissed as weakness. Their suffering was not recognised as an illness but treated as a nuisance. Families described them as fragile, hysterical, or troublesome. Neighbours whispered about nerves or a delicate constitution. Society placed the blame on character rather than on the drug itself. Instead of receiving treatment or compassion, these women were often silenced, hidden, or ignored. The voices that asked for relief were met not with care but with condescension. Inside households, the response was almost always the same. Women who begged for help were told to rest, to stop exaggerating, or to control themselves. When their pain became too obvious to ignore, they were locked away in bedrooms with curtains drawn. The outside world kept far from view. Silence was demanded, both for the sake of reputation and the supposed comfort of the patient. The cries from behind closed doors were left unanswered, dismissed as meaningless. It is almost sarcastic that society celebrated its ideals of morality and family values while leaving women to cry alone in darkened rooms. Doctors, who should have been their advocates, often failed them. When called to see a woman trembling, incoherent, or overwhelmed, many responded not by reducing laudanum but by prescribing more. Sedatives, tonics, or calming drops were handed out, often containing the very substance that caused the problem. The advice was to take a little more to calm the nerves, to ease the mind, to silence the complaints. Instead of offering relief, the medical profession deepened the dependency, trapping women further in cycles of use that were nearly impossible to escape. If we compare this to today, it would be like a patient seeking help for an overdose and being sent home with an even stronger supply of the same drug. Families often accepted this advice without question. They trusted the authority of doctors, believing that more medicine was the answer. Mothers, daughters, and wives continued to consume laudanum under the guise of treatment. Their worsening condition was explained away as weakness of spirit or flaws of femininity. Husbands who grew tired of their wives' suffering retreated into denial, blaming personality rather than medicine. Children were told their mothers were sickly, nervous, or unstable, never that they were victims of a dangerous drug. The silence around the true cause ensured that nothing changed. The label of hysteria became a convenient shield. It excused neglect and justified confinement. Women who cried out were not seen as people in need of medical help but as irritations to be managed. Some were placed in darkened rooms for days at a time, their only company bottles of the very drug that had brought them there. They were treated less as patients and more as problems, contained and ignored until they grew quiet. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women locked in rooms, dismissed by families, and dosed further by doctors, all while society insisted they were simply weak-minded. Servants bore witness to much of this cruelty. They carried trays of food to rooms that remained untouched, changed sheets soaked with sweat, and listened to muffled sobs behind doors they were told never to open without permission. Yet they too remained silent. Their loyalty was demanded. Their voices suppressed by fear of losing work. They followed orders, keeping the secrets of their employers, helping maintain the facade of order while the truth festered inside. The silence spread beyond households. Communities accepted the idea that women's suffering was simply part of their nature. To speak of laudanum as a cause was rare. Instead, illness was described as weakness, addiction as hysteria, and despair as female instability. These labels removed responsibility from doctors, families, and society, placing the blame squarely on the women themselves. With no recognition of the true problem, countless women endured their suffering in isolation. The cruelest part was that many of these women still believed they were at fault. They felt shame for their trembling hands, guilt for their tears, and weakness for their dependence. They accepted confinement and more medicine, thinking it was the only way forward. The silence of the world around them left no room for understanding or hope. They remained trapped, punished not only by the drug but by the stigma that came with it. Laudanum's grip was not just chemical but social. It turned the cries of women into evidence against them. It transformed medical advice into poison. It made families choose silence over truth. Every layer of society reinforced the cycle, ensuring that suffering women remained unseen and unheard. What should have been cries for rescue became proof of weakness, and the drug continued its work unchecked. These cries were not treated as calls for help but as signs of frailty. Doctors prescribed more poison, families locked doors, and society looked away. Women begged to be saved, but their words echoed only within dark rooms, and as they were silenced, their dependence grew deeper, leading them further into despair. They were dismissed as hysterical, treated as fragile, and poisoned further under the name of medicine. Their cries were erased, their rooms locked, and their suffering hidden. But confinement and silence only pushed them further down, toward a stage where bedrooms themselves turned into prisons. The rooms meant for rest and recovery slowly turned into prisons. Once, they had been private spaces where women could retreat after long days or illnesses. Now they became locked chambers, places where the addicted were hidden rather than healed. Doors were shut, keys turned, and visitors no longer admitted. Curtains stayed drawn across windows, cutting out light and sound from the world outside. What should have been a place of comfort became a cell of silence. Families told themselves this was necessary. They insisted that keeping a woman confined protected her dignity. Better to hide her weakness behind closed doors than let neighbours see the truth. Reputations mattered more than health. The quiet halls of the house echoed with excuses, while the person inside the locked room wasted away. Their decline was explained as sickness, nerves, or exhaustion, but never as laudanum. It feels almost sarcastic that the same families who cared so deeply about social respectability allowed their homes to become prisons for their own wives and daughters. The treatment within these rooms was not medical, but custodial. Servants brought food on trays, though the meals often went untouched. They changed linens, carried away empty bottles, and wiped faces damp with sweat. Yet they were ordered never to speak of what they saw. They followed instructions, saying nothing even when the mistress could no longer walk steadily or speak clearly. Their silence became part of the imprisonment, another layer of control over the truth. The women inside these rooms bore the weight of isolation. They lay in beds that no longer offered rest, surrounded by shadows and silence. They listened to voices in the house outside but rarely heard their names spoken. Their only company was the drug itself, kept within reach in drawers or boxes. Hours stretched into days, days into weeks, and weeks into years. In that time, their world shrank until only the bed, the bottle, and the silence remained. For the family, the locked room became a shield. They could host dinners, attend balls, and maintain their public image without acknowledging what lay upstairs. Guests who asked about absent wives or sisters were told simple lies: she was resting, she was unwell, she needed quiet. These words smoothed over the truth, and society accepted them without question. Behind the polite phrases was an imprisoned woman, forgotten except when her cries grew too loud to ignore. If we compare this to today, it would be like locking a relative addicted to opioids in a bedroom and calling it treatment, while continuing to smile at neighbours as if nothing were wrong. The imprisoned women often tried to resist at first. They begged for help, pleaded to leave the room, or demanded to be heard. But their words were dismissed as hysteria or weakness. Doors remained locked, and windows stayed covered. Over time, resistance faded. They grew quieter, less demanding, and finally resigned. The drug dulled their will, and the silence of their families completed the work. The servants who entered these rooms carried unspoken burdens. They were witnesses to suffering but forbidden to act. They cleaned, fed, and comforted. but always within limits set by the family. Some pitied their mistress, others resented the extra work, but none dared to speak. Their silence reinforced the walls of the prison just as much as the locked doors. The trapped women themselves became ghosts long before they died. Their presence in the household was acknowledged only in whispers. Children were told their mothers were resting. Husbands avoided mention of them in public. Their names slowly disappeared from conversations, as if they no longer existed. Yet upstairs, behind locked doors, they continued to breathe, cry, and dose themselves into numbness. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how easily families erase their own members, trading lives for reputation and silence. These rooms, lined with fine wallpaper and soft curtains, gave the appearance of comfort but served as cells. They were prisons disguised as bedrooms, cells disguised as care. What was called protection was really abandonment, and what was called dignity was really silence. Women locked inside knew this truth, even if they could not voice it. Their imprisonment was not to save them, but to save the image of those outside. The cycle repeated across countless homes. Families feared shame, servants feared dismissal, and society feared scandal. In that fear, the addicted were hidden away, left to decline alone. Their suffering was not treated, their dependence not addressed, their humanity not acknowledged. They were simply locked out of the world, their voices unheard, their lives reduced to shadows behind closed doors. The bedrooms of Victorian houses became prisons for women whose only crime was dependence on a drug sold in every pharmacy. Families turned keys, ordered silence, and called it protection. But in truth, it was abandonment dressed as dignity, and behind each locked door, lives faded quietly, erased long before death came. They were locked away in their own homes, their families calling it protection, their servants ordered to keep quiet. In reality, these bedrooms were prisons where women were left to waste away. Soon, the silence of those rooms would stretch into decades, and some would live entire lives hidden from the world they once belonged to. Some people never returned from the darkness that Laudanum created. Once confined to their rooms, they remained there not for weeks or months, but for years. What began as a short period of rest stretched into decades. Curtains were never drawn back, doors rarely opened, and the world outside slowly forgot that they existed. The drug dictated their every moment, awake or asleep, hungry or weak. Nothing mattered more than the next spoonful. Their lives became cycles of dosing, drifting, and waiting. Each day followed the same rhythm. They woke from a restless half-sleep, hands shaking, mouth dry, body aching. The first thought was of the bottle, hidden in drawers or beside the bed. Servants delivered it quietly, along with food that was often ignored. A few drops calmed the nerves, dulled the pain, and pulled them back into a fog. Hours passed without distinction. They dozed, stirred, and then dozed again. To them, days and nights blended into a single stretch of shadows and silence. It is almost grotesquely ironic that people once admired for their refinement spent 20 years doing nothing but drifting between stupor and wakefulness. Families began to speak of them less and less. At first, there were explanations for their absence. Visitors were told the patient was unwell, resting, or recovering. Over time, those excuses grew thin. Friends stopped asking, neighbours stopped noticing, and even relatives avoided the subject. The silence was easier than the shame. Eventually, the person upstairs vanished not only from society but from memory. Their names disappeared from conversations, their faces forgotten by those who once loved them. Inside the room, the changes were slow but relentless. The body weakened with each passing year, muscles wasted, hair thinned, and skin grew fragile. Simple movements became difficult. Writing letters, once a comfort, became impossible when hands trembled too much to hold a pen. Reading, once a distraction, became unbearable when eyes could no longer focus. The world shrank to the space of a bed. The outlines of curtains, and the shape of the bottle. Nothing else mattered. The servants who attended these long confinements lived with the burden of routine. They carried trays of untouched meals, replaced soiled linens, and refilled bottles without comment. Some pitied their mistress or master, others resented the endless duty, but none dared to break the silence. They too were trapped in the cycle, forced to act as guards for prisoners who were never allowed to leave. If we compare this to today, it would be like a family keeping a relative in a locked bedroom for 20 years with nothing but narcotics and water, calling it care while quietly erasing them from the family's life. The women who suffered in this way lost all sense of self. They had once been celebrated at gatherings, admired for beauty or wit, included in the life of their communities. Now they were shadows, unable to recall the sound of music at a ball, the taste of fresh air, or the feel of sunlight. They lived only in memory, and even those memories blurred under the haze of laudanum. The person they had been was gone, replaced by a figure who drifted endlessly between half-sleep and stupor. Occasionally, these prisoners of laudanum tried to resist. They attempted to reduce their doses, refusing drops in the morning or declining the evening spoonful. The results were unbearable. Hands shook violently, thoughts became incoherent, and the craving tore at them with relentless force. Their families, seeing the distress, encouraged more medicine. Doctors confirmed it, prescribing stronger mixtures to ease the discomfort. Every attempt at freedom led to deeper chains. Resistance faded quickly, and surrender became the only option. The passage of years turned these rooms into tombs for the living. Dust gathered in corners, wallpaper faded, and curtains hung heavy with neglect. The houses themselves carried on. Parties were thrown, children grew, fortunes shifted, but inside the locked bedrooms, nothing changed. The person inside remained frozen in time, surviving only through the endless rhythm of laudanum. Life continued outside, but inside, it was always the same day, repeated again and again. Families bore the shame quietly. To admit that a wife, mother, or sister had wasted away in such a manner was unthinkable. They preferred to let the silence linger, to keep the truth hidden. When conversations arose, they spoke of illness, of delicate health, of nerves. The word laudanum was rarely mentioned. The drug remained both the cause and the secret, the unspoken reality behind polite lies. I cannot help but feel disturbed when I think about how many families lived their lives around such secrets, treating absence as if it were simply another form of respectability. The years stretched on without mercy. Some lived like this for 20 years or more, never stepping outside, never reclaiming the lives they once had. For those around them, the confinement became ordinary. Children grew up barely remembering their mothers. Husbands adjusted to the absence, finding distractions in society or business. Servants carried on their duties without question. The imprisoned women became more ghost than person, existing only as faint presences behind closed doors. Death, when it finally arrived, was slow and silent. Bodies weakened by decades of neglect simply gave out. There were no dramatic endings, no scenes of redemption or escape. Death came quietly, in the same bed where years had been wasted. Sometimes the body was discovered hours later, sometimes days. Families arranged quiet burials, avoiding public notice. There were no large funerals, no tributes, no remembrances. The dead slipped into the ground as silently as they had lived in their locked rooms. Society rarely acknowledged these lives. Newspapers did not record their stories. Doctors did not publish their cases. Families erased their names from records, photographs, and conversations. The shame was too heavy to bear. What remained were whispers, hints, and fragments of diaries or letters hidden away. For all practical purposes, these people ceased to exist long before they died. The legacy of such long imprisonments was devastating. Entire decades of life were lost to silence, shame, and dependence. Children grew up without mothers, husbands without wives, and families without truth. The drug that had promised relief had instead erased lives, turning homes into prisons and women into ghosts. And yet, even as this happened, society continued to sell, prescribe, and trust laudanum. These lives wasted in silence reveal the true cruelty of addiction and denial. The drug was consumed for decades without protest. Families preserved reputations instead of people. Doctors gave more poison instead of less. The victims lived in shadows, unseen and unheard, until even their deaths passed quietly. They lived in endless loops of dosing and despair, forgotten by the world outside. Their families erased them, their doctors betrayed them, and their homes became prisons. In the end, their deaths were as quiet as their lives, leaving no mark except the silence they carried. And in that silence, the drug claimed its victory, one life at a time. They lived in locked rooms for 20 years, caught between waking and dreaming, erased from memory and denied by society. Their deaths came slowly, without notice, without grief. But the story of laudanum's grip did not end there. It continued to spread, pulling even the young into its cycle, often under the guise of something as simple as a cure for a cough. For many young women, laudanum entered their lives in the simplest of ways. A cough that would not go away, a sore throat that lingered through the winter, or a wheeze that interrupted nights of study brought them to the attention of family and doctors. The advice was nearly always the same. Take a spoonful of laudanum, just a few drops before bed, to ease the lungs and allow rest. It was prescribed with confidence, as if it were no different from warm tea or honey. Parents followed this advice without question, trusting that medicine would protect their daughters. At first, the effects seemed almost miraculous. The coughing stopped, nights were peaceful, and mornings brought relief. Families believed the worst was over. Bottles of laudanum sat on shelves like trusted allies, used sparingly at first and then more regularly as the coughs returned. A nightly habit formed, one that seemed harmless. Soon, the girls themselves expected it, reaching for the drops as naturally as they reached for blankets before sleep. It is almost ridiculous that a treatment for cough turned into a lifetime sentence of dependence, but that is exactly what happened in countless homes. The transformation did not happen overnight. Weeks of calm turned into months, and the young women found themselves unable to sleep without the medicine. The body adjusted quickly, making rest impossible without it. The bottles that once lasted weeks now emptied within days. Parents noticed, but they told themselves it was simply good care, that their daughters were delicate and needed more support. The drug became part of the routine, accepted as normal, as necessary, as unquestionable. For the girls, the changes crept in quietly. Their studies began to suffer. Once sharp minds dulled, struggling to focus on books or lessons. Writing became difficult as their hands trembled, and their memory slipped in confusing ways. Teachers scolded them for laziness, unaware of what truly held them back. What had begun as a cough remedy now determined their every thought and action. They were no longer simply students but prisoners of a nightly dose. The effects on appearance were undeniable. Skin grew pale, eyes sank into dark hollows, and weight dropped from frames once considered healthy. Mirrors reflected strangers back at them. They no longer recognized their own faces. The bright expressions of youth gave way to hollow stares and exhausted lines. Families whispered excuses, blaming nerves, poor diet, or weakness of constitution. The truth remained locked in drawers with the bottles. If we compare this to today, it would be like high school students being prescribed narcotics for a cough and ending up addicted before graduation, their families excusing the decline as simple stress. The social consequences were severe. Girls who had once been admired for intelligence or charm withdrew from gatherings. They turned down invitations, preferring the safety of their bedrooms where the drug was always close at hand. Friends drifted away, confused by the sudden change. In some cases, potential suitors lost interest, unwilling to attach themselves to women who seemed frail or unstable. Lives that had once seemed full of promise shrank into narrow routines defined by laudanum. Doctors often failed to recognize their role in this decline. When families called them back to examine worsening conditions, many simply increased the dosage. The cough may have been gone, but the dependence had taken its place. Physicians, unwilling to admit harm, prescribed more laudanum for nerves, sleeplessness, or weakness. Instead of curing the young women, they entrenched them deeper in the cycle. I find it troubling to imagine how many bright futures were erased by the careless advice of trusted doctors who prescribed poison without hesitation. Servants who cared for these young women saw the changes most clearly. They noticed the uneaten meals, the hours spent in bed, the bottles hidden under pillows. Some tried to help, suggesting rest without the drug, but their words carried no weight against doctors' orders and family expectations. Their duty was to obey, not to question. They carried the trays, fetched the bottles, and watched silently as the girls faded. Over time, the isolation deepened. Families began to feel shame, no longer discussing their daughters openly. They stopped boasting of academic achievements, stopped bringing them to public events, and stopped arranging introductions. The silence grew heavy, and the young women grew invisible. Their lives, once filled with promise, were erased by dependence. The drug that had begun as a cure for a simple cough now determined every part of their existence. The tragedy was not rare but common. Coughs were frequent in crowded Victorian towns, where smoke filled the air and illnesses spread quickly. Nearly every family faced them, and nearly every family turned to laudanum. The scale of the problem ensured that many daughters, once bright and strong, ended up hidden in rooms, pale and unrecognizable, their futures quietly destroyed. Some of these women lived on for years, surviving in cycles of sleep, fog, and craving. Others declined quickly, their bodies too fragile to withstand the strain. Deaths were explained as weakness, illness, or misfortune. But the truth was rarely spoken. No one wanted to admit that trusted medicine had turned into poison. The silence ensured that the cycle continued, generation after generation. The story of these young women revealed the most devastating part of laudanum's reach. It not only destroys those who sought escape, but also those who trusted it for something as ordinary as a cough. It turned students into invalids, bright futures into forgotten names, and families into silent witnesses of decline. The bottles that sat innocently beside beds carried ruin with every drop, and no one wanted to face the truth. Laudanum entered their lives through sickness and remained through habit. It erased ambition, altered faces, and reshaped identities. By the time the truth was visible, it was too late. Families had lost daughters, schools had lost students, and society had lost countless futures. All of it began with the simple advice to take a spoonful for a cough. They started with laudanum for a cough, and they ended up unable to recognize themselves. The drug promised rest but gave decline, promised calm but gave dependence. Their families hid the truth, their doctors deepened the problem, and their lives slipped quietly into silence. And just as these girls wasted away in their rooms, laudanum continued to spread into other parts of society, appearing even in the places people went to drink and celebrate. Laudanum was not only found in homes and medicine cabinets, it slipped into public life as well, becoming part of the culture of drinking and entertainment. Taverns and private clubs discovered that mixing laudanum with alcohol created a powerful attraction. Soon, special drinks appeared on menus, advertised quietly by word of mouth. They were given names that sounded inviting rather than dangerous. Purple Dream, Cardinal's Tea, and other titles suggested elegance and indulgence, not poison. Patrons ordered them as if they were ordinary cocktails, unaware or unwilling to admit what they truly contained. The practice was especially common in establishments that catered to the middle-aged and the wealthy. Women who no longer attended dances and dinners came to taverns or private rooms for comfort. They sipped their laudanum cocktails with the same grace they once reserved for afternoon tea. At first, it was only one glass, perhaps taken for nerves or sleep. Soon, it became 2 or 3, until conversation slowed, words slurred, and entire evenings vanished into fog. It is almost laughable that respectable society condemned gin drinkers in the streets, while quietly sipping laudanum cocktails behind closed doors. The drinks were prepared in secrecy. Bartenders measured drops into wine, whiskey, or herbal infusions, stirring carefully so the bitterness would be hidden. Recipes varied, but the effect was always the same. The combination of alcohol and laudanum hit quickly, numbing both body and mind. Patrons leaned back in their chairs, their eyes glassy, their words incoherent. Some laughed uncontrollably, others grew silent, staring at nothing. By the end of the night, they were carried out or left to sleep in corners, their dignity forgotten. The clientele was surprisingly consistent. Older women, often widows or wives whose husbands were absent, frequented these establishments. For them, the cocktail was both escape and routine. They arrived with poise, ordered discreetly, and left hours later unable to stand. Wealthy men also indulged, adding laudanum cocktails to their evenings of drinking and gambling. The drug blurred judgment, dulled conscience, and made the passage of hours easier to ignore. Behind curtains and in private rooms, addiction mingled with entertainment until the two were indistinguishable. Servants often escorted their mistresses or masters home, struggling to conceal the truth. They supported staggering figures down cobblestone streets, guiding them through doors before neighbours could see. Excuses were prepared: illness, fatigue, or too much wine. The bottles remained hidden, and the shame remained unspoken. What mattered was that reputation stayed intact, even as health and dignity collapsed. If we compare this to today, it would be like fashionable bars serving narcotics and cocktails, while wealthy patrons treated it as harmless fun instead of a deadly risk. The atmosphere of these taverns reflected the duality of indulgence and decay. Lights were dim, music played softly, and laughter filled the air at the start of the night. But as hours passed, the sound shifted. Conversation slowed, laughter grew hollow, and silence spread across tables. Bodies slumped, glasses tipped, and eyes glazed over. What began as a celebration ended in stupor. Bartenders and owners cared little, as long as money flowed and seats stayed filled. The demand for these special drinks never waned. For some, the cocktails became a replacement for meals. They arrived without eating, drank laudanum mixtures until full, and left without nourishment. Their bodies weakened, but their cravings grew. Families noticed changes but often excused them, believing their relatives were simply tired or unwell. Few admitted that nights spent in taverns were nights of slow poisoning. The illusion of sophistication covered the truth of dependence. Doctors occasionally raised concerns, but their voices were rarely heard. Many of them prescribed laudanum themselves, so condemning its presence in taverns would have been hypocrisy. Instead, they blamed overindulgence in alcohol, never mentioning the stronger element mixed inside. Society accepted this explanation easily. It was simpler to talk about drunkenness than to confront the growing plague of laudanum addiction. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how blindness and denial allowed bars to become suppliers of narcotics without consequence. The cocktail spread quickly across cities, especially in London, where nightlife thrived. Hidden behind coded names, they passed unnoticed by officials and respectable society. Patrons treated them as luxuries, indulgences for the sophisticated. Yet behind the glamour, the effects were devastating. People lost not only their health, but also their reputations, slipping into addiction without realizing how deep they had fallen. Women who once held respected positions in society found themselves mocked for incoherence, avoided for their trembling, or abandoned entirely by their families. Men lost fortunes at gambling tables, their minds too clouded to recognize their losses. Taverns profited, but households crumbled. What began as a fashionable secret turned into widespread ruin. The cycle of secrecy reinforced itself. Patrons pretended they were only drinking wine. Bartenders pretended they were only serving cocktails. Families pretended they were only tired. The truth remained hidden under layers of denial. Yet the signs were everywhere: slurred speech, wasted bodies, broken reputations. The cocktail culture did not simply hide laudanum use. It encouraged it, dressed it up as elegance, and sold it as entertainment. The tragedy was that many of those who indulged believed they were safe. They saw themselves as different from the poor who relied on laudanum for survival. They thought their use was sophisticated, controlled, and harmless. But the drug did not distinguish between classes. Addiction grew just as quickly in taverns as it did in slums. The end result was always the same: bodies broken, minds clouded, and lives erased. As nights stretched into years, these hidden cocktails left scars that families could not conceal. Patrons wasted away, their reputations shattered, their futures lost. The drinks that promised pleasure delivered only dependence. And yet, the taverns remained full. The names of the cocktails whispered with fascination. The bottles of laudanum mixed freely. They called them Purple Dream and Cardinal's Tea. But what they truly served was slow death in a glass. Patrons laughed at first, then slumped in silence, and finally wasted away. The bars profited, the families denied, and the cycle deepened. But the next stage of ruin was even darker, as death began to follow patrons into the very rooms where they thought they had found escape. The bathrooms of Victorian homes, often small, cold, and lined with stone, became the sites of some of the darkest endings for laudanum addicts. Unlike bedrooms, which allowed secrecy and silence, these rooms revealed the grim reality of the drug in stark, undeniable ways. Many were found slumped in bathtubs, a half-empty bottle still in hand, their bodies already stiff and the water around them cold. What began as an attempt to change, to reduce doses, or to regain control often ended with sudden death. The heart, long weakened by dependence, could not endure even the smallest shift. The decision to reduce laudanum often came from desperation. Some believed they could cut back a little each day, convincing themselves they had the strength. Others tried to replace doses with tea, broth, or wine, hoping the cravings would pass. But the body did not cooperate. The smallest reduction triggered violent reactions, trembling hands, racing hearts, and waves of unbearable anxiety. Those who tried to take control often collapsed within hours, their hearts failing before family members even realized what was happening. It feels cruelly ironic that attempts to escape the drug often kill faster than surrendering to it completely. Family members often found them too late. Servants sent to draw baths returned to discover the still bodies of their mistresses or masters, the surface of the water unmoving, the bottles of laudanum nearby. In some cases, the dead still clutched a glass, their fingers frozen around it. Their eyes, open and unblinking, stared at ceilings or walls as if locked in final terror. Relatives quickly invented explanations. The death was sudden, illness, exhaustion, or natural decline. Rarely did anyone admit what the bottles revealed so clearly. The tragedy was not confined to baths alone. Writing tables, often placed in bedrooms or studies, became the setting for final moments as well. Some addicts, aware of their failing health, tried to leave behind letters of farewell. They scribbled apologies, explanations, or pleas for forgiveness, but the drug rarely gave them time to finish. Many letters ended mid-sentence, the ink still wet, the handwriting shaky and broken. Families burned these fragments or locked them away, refusing to let outsiders know the truth. If we compare this to today, it would be like finding overdose victims with unsent text messages still open on their phones, final words never reaching the people they were meant for. The shame surrounding these deaths weighed heavily on families. Bathrooms were scrubbed quickly, letters destroyed, and servants ordered into silence. Neighbours were told nothing more than vague phrases. She passed in her sleep, or he grew weak in the night. The word laudanum remained unspoken. To admit it would have meant disgrace, not only for the victim, but for the entire household. Silence preserved reputations, but erased the humanity of the dead. Servants bore the scars of these discoveries. They were the ones who found bodies in tubs, who cleaned away evidence, who followed orders to bury the truth. Some whispered quietly in kitchens or back alleys, but their words carried little weight and great risk. Most kept their silence, haunted by the images of lifeless figures still holding bottles, water long gone cold around them. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining how many ordinary servants lived with memories of such scenes, unable to speak, yet unable to forget. The pattern repeated across homes and across classes. Wealthy families hid deaths behind velvet curtains and stone walls. Poor families buried their dead quietly, often without doctors, and rarely with clear explanations. In both cases, laudanum was the cause, but silence was the response. Society refused to name the drug as the killer, preferring instead to let the cycle continue. Medical authorities did little to intervene. Doctors still prescribed laudanum freely, despite knowing its dangers. They called death sudden, unexplained, or natural, avoiding the truth that their own prescriptions had set the stage. Pharmacies continued to profit, selling bottles by the thousands without restriction. Even as deaths mounted, the flow of laudanum did not slow. It was as if the very structure of society depended on looking the other way. The bathrooms, however, told stories that could not be erased so easily. Unlike bedrooms, which could hide suffering for years, bathrooms showed sudden finality. A cold tub, an empty bottle, an unfinished letter, these left no room for denial. Families might cover it up, but those who witnessed the scenes could not forget. These moments revealed the fragility of addicts' lives, the constant threat of sudden collapse, and the desperation that came with trying to break free. For those who tried to reduce their intake, the struggle was not only physical but also psychological. The fear of life without laudanum clashed with the fear of what it was doing to their bodies. They stood at mirrors, pale and trembling, trying to convince themselves they could endure. They poured smaller doses, counting drops with shaking hands. Yet the body resisted, the mind rebelled, and the heart often gave out. The tragedy was that their deaths often came in the very moments when they showed the greatest will to change. These deaths in bathrooms and at writing desks marked a turning point in the story of laudanum. They revealed not only the strength of addiction, but also the futility of silence. Each body found in water, each unfinished letter, was a testimony to the danger that society refused to confront. Yet the silence endured. Families buried their dead quietly, burned their words, and returned to their lives as though nothing had happened. The cruelty of laudanum was that it gave no gentle endings. Its victims did not drift peacefully away but died in cold water, with bottles in hand, or with pens frozen mid-sentence. Their final moments were lonely, desperate, and hidden. And yet, those who remained alive continued to trust the same medicine, pouring drops into glasses and swallowing the poison that had killed so many before them. They tried to reduce the drug and found only death. They were discovered in bathtubs, in studies, in bedrooms, their bottles empty and their eyes still open. Families erased the evidence, doctors refused to admit fault, and servants carried memories they could never speak aloud. But even as these tragedies multiplied, society still kept its silence, and that silence ensured that laudanum would continue its work, spreading destruction in every corner of Victorian life. They died in bathrooms, in water gone cold, still holding bottles of laudanum. They left behind unfinished letters, words never read, stories never told. Their deaths revealed the cost of silence, but society continued to look away. And as the cycle went on, the addiction began to erode not just individuals or families, but the very fabric of the community itself. The stigma of laudanum addiction fell most heavily on women. While men who suffered from dependence were often excused or quietly ignored, women were judged harshly. Their addiction was not seen as an illness, but as a shame that reflected on the entire family. A woman who relied on laudanum was described as weak, superstitious, or lacking in willpower. Her condition was treated as a moral failure, not a medical one. Families whispered of disgrace, and society looked at her with contempt. In many households, the husband's response was to walk away. Some abandoned their wives entirely, leaving them to wither behind closed doors. Others stayed in the same house but treated their wives as invisible, refusing to acknowledge them at gatherings or even within the home. Children were often removed, sent to live with relatives, or raised by servants, as though their mother's presence was dangerous. The family name mattered more than her suffering. It is almost sarcastic that men who drank themselves into ruin were excused as stressed providers, while women addicted to medicine prescribed by doctors were condemned as family disgraces. Neighbours reinforced the stigma. They gossiped about women who never appeared at church, who stayed hidden behind curtains, who grew pale and thin. Rumours spread quickly, branding them as unstable or cursed. Invitations stopped arriving, friendships ended, and entire households became isolated. The shame did not belong only to the woman, but infected everyone connected to her. Families preferred silence to scandal, but silence could not erase the judgment of the community. Doctors, too, were complicit in this unequal treatment. When men suffered from laudanum dependence, physicians often blamed overwork, business stress, or poor health. When women showed the same symptoms, they were labelled hysterical, foolish, or superstitious. Instead of compassion, they received scorn disguised as medical opinion. Prescriptions continued, but so did the judgment. In this way, doctors both deepened their dependence and justified society's cruelty. Within homes, the stigma became a weapon. Husbands used it to justify abandonment, relatives used it to take children, and families used it to explain failures. Women addicted to laudanum were blamed not only for their condition, but for every consequence that followed. If children grew sick, it was the mother's fault. If the household's reputation declined, she was the cause. No recognition was given to the fact that doctors had recommended the drug, or that society had normalized its use. If we compare this to today, it would be like condemning mothers for becoming dependent on opioids prescribed to them, while excusing men for the same addiction as understandable stress relief. The cruelty was magnified by the expectations placed on women. They were supposed to embody virtue, discipline, and strength of character. When laudanum stripped these qualities away, they were judged as failures of femininity itself. Their suffering was not treated with empathy, but with ridicule. The contradiction was painful. Women had been encouraged to use laudanum for their health, yet when they became dependent, they were accused of weakness. Servants witnessed this double standard daily. They saw men stagger home drunk and still treated with respect, while women who trembled in their beds were mocked or abandoned. They carried children away from mothers who wept silently, following the orders of fathers who had already erased their wives from family life. Their silence, once again, kept the system in place. They could do nothing but watch as women were condemned for what society itself had created. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women punished twice, once by the drug and again by the judgment of everyone around them. The stigma extended beyond individual families into the wider culture. Plays, pamphlets, and newspapers portrayed addicted women as cautionary tales. They were mocked as examples of vanity, weakness, or immorality. Their suffering was reduced to caricature, stripping away any recognition of their humanity. Meanwhile, addicted men were rarely mentioned at all. The imbalance was stark, and it reinforced the silence that surrounded women's suffering. Some women internalized the blame. They accepted the idea that they were weak, that their addiction was a personal failing rather than the result of widespread medical negligence. They withdrew further into silence, ashamed to ask for help or even to admit the truth to themselves. This self-blame deepened the cycle, making escape even less possible. They were trapped not only by the drug but by the weight of judgment. The loss was devastating. Families were broken apart, reputations destroyed, and lives erased. Children grew up without mothers, not because death had taken them, but because stigma had stolen them away. Husbands remarried, households moved on, and the addicted women remained behind locked doors, forgotten. The silence ensured that their stories rarely survived. They became invisible long before they died, erased from memory by the very people who should have protected them. This double standard revealed the hypocrisy of Victorian society. The same culture that celebrated morality and discipline allowed women to be condemned for conditions it had created. The same families that preached respectability abandoned their wives and daughters. The same doctors who promoted laudanum mocked the women who became dependent on it. The injustice was complete, and it left scars that stretched across generations. The harsh reality was that women were punished not for their choices but for their gender. Men could stumble in taverns, gamble away fortunes, or waste themselves with laudanum cocktails and still be seen as respectable. Women, however, were condemned for every symptom, every weakness, every bottle. They bore the shame alone, locked away in silence, while society continued to look the other way. They were called weak, foolish, and disgraceful. Husbands left them, children were taken from them, and communities whispered against them. Doctors reinforced the cruelty, families accepted it, and society thrived on it. Women carried the full weight of stigma, while men escaped with excuses. But as their dependence deepened, some women began to take even more desperate measures, turning to methods that reveal the terrifying lengths addiction could reach. The stigma of laudanum addiction fell most heavily on women. While men who suffered from dependence were often excused or quietly ignored, women were judged harshly. Their addiction was not seen as an illness, but as a shame that reflected on the entire family. A woman who relied on laudanum was described as weak, superstitious, or lacking in willpower. Her condition was treated as a moral failure, not a medical one. Families whispered of disgrace, and society looked at her with contempt. In many households, the husband's response was to walk away. Some abandoned their wives entirely, leaving them to wither behind closed doors. Others stayed in the same house but treated their wives as invisible, refusing to acknowledge them at gatherings or even within the home. Children were often removed, sent to live with relatives, or raised by servants, as though their mother's presence was dangerous. The family name mattered more than her suffering. It is almost sarcastic that men who drank themselves into ruin were excused as stress providers, while women addicted to medicine prescribed by doctors were condemned as family disgraces. Neighbours reinforced the stigma. They gossiped about women who never appeared at church, who stayed hidden behind curtains, who grew pale and thin. Rumours spread quickly, branding them as unstable or cursed. Invitations stopped arriving, friendships ended, and entire households became isolated. The shame did not belong only to the woman but infected everyone connected to her. Families preferred silence to scandal, but silence could not erase the judgment of the community. Doctors, too, were complicit in this unequal treatment. When men suffered from laudanum dependence, physicians often blamed overwork, business stress, or poor health. When women showed the same symptoms, they were labelled hysterical, foolish, or superstitious. Instead of compassion, they received scorn disguised as medical opinion. Prescriptions continued, but so did the judgment. In this way, doctors both deepened their dependence and justified society's cruelty. Within homes, the stigma became a weapon. Husbands used it to justify abandonment, relatives used it to take children, and families used it to explain failures. Women addicted to laudanum were blamed not only for their condition, but for every consequence that followed. If children grew sick, it was the mother's fault. If the household's reputation declined, she was the cause. No recognition was given to the fact that doctors had recommended the drug or that society had normalized its use. If we compare this to today, it would be like condemning mothers for becoming dependent on opioids prescribed to them, while excusing men for the same addiction as understandable stress relief. The cruelty was magnified by the expectations placed on women. They were supposed to embody virtue, discipline, and strength of character. When laudanum stripped these qualities away, they were judged as failures of femininity itself. Their suffering was not treated with empathy but with ridicule. The contradiction was painful. Women had been encouraged to use laudanum for their health, yet when they became dependent, they were accused of weakness. Servants witnessed this double standard daily. They saw men stagger home drunk and still treated with respect, while women who trembled in their beds were mocked or abandoned. They carried children away from mothers who wept silently, following the orders of fathers who had already erased their wives from family life. Their silence, once again, kept the system in place. They could do nothing but watch as women were condemned for what society itself had created. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women punished twice, once by the drug and again by the judgment of everyone around them. The stigma extended beyond individual families into the wider culture. Plays, pamphlets, and newspapers portrayed addicted women as cautionary tales. They were mocked as examples of vanity, weakness, or immorality. Their suffering was reduced to caricature, stripping away any recognition of their humanity. Meanwhile, addicted men were rarely mentioned at all. The imbalance was stark, and it reinforced the silence that surrounded women's suffering. Some women internalized the blame. They accepted the idea that they were weak, that their addiction was a personal failing rather than the result of widespread medical negligence. They withdrew further into silence, ashamed to ask for help or even to admit the truth to themselves. This self-blame deepened the cycle, making escape even less possible. They were trapped not only by the drug but by the weight of judgment. The loss was devastating. Families were broken apart, reputations destroyed, and lives erased. Children grew up without mothers, not because death had taken them, but because stigma had stolen them away. Husbands remarried, households moved on, and the addicted women remained behind locked doors, forgotten. The silence ensured that their stories rarely survived. They became invisible long before they died, erased from memory by the very people who should have protected them. This double standard revealed the hypocrisy of Victorian society. The same culture that celebrated morality and discipline allowed women to be condemned for conditions it had created. The same families that preached respectability abandoned their wives and daughters. The same doctors who promoted laudanum mocked the women who became dependent on it. The injustice was complete, and it left scars that stretched across generations. The harsh reality was that women were punished not for their choices, but for their gender. Men could stumble in taverns, gamble away fortunes, or waste themselves with laudanum cocktails and still be seen as respectable. Women, however, were condemned for every symptom, every weakness, every bottle. They bore the shame alone, locked away in silence, while society continued to look the other way. They were called weak, foolish, and disgraceful. Husbands left them, children were taken from them, and communities whispered against them. Doctors reinforced the cruelty, families accepted it, and society thrived on it. Women carried the full weight of stigma, while men escaped with excuses. But as their dependence deepened, some women began to take even more desperate measures, turning to methods that revealed the terrifying lengths addiction could reach. Addiction drove some people to terrifying extremes. For those whose bodies no longer responded to the usual drops, desperation took them down paths that revealed just how completely laudanum had consumed them. The tolerance built up over the years made the drug's effects weaker, forcing them to seek stronger ways to feel its presence. What began with teaspoons in tea or wine ended with actions that shocked even those who had lived in silence for years. Some addicts began cutting into their own skin, pouring the drug directly into their wounds, convinced this was the only way left to satisfy the cravings. The sight of their arms told the story. Faded scars and fresh cuts crisscrossed their skin, lines carved by hands too desperate to care about pain. They no longer felt fear of the blade or the sting of blood. For them, the pain had disappeared beneath the hunger for laudanum. Servants sometimes caught glimpses while changing clothes or cleaning linens wrists marked with rows of old wounds, forearms pocked with darkened scars. Families pretended not to notice, turning their eyes away, unwilling to admit the horror happening inside their homes. It is almost grotesquely ironic that the same society that fainted at the sight of bare ankles ignored women carving open their arms for drops of medicine. The act itself was both ritual and necessity. They would take a blade, make a shallow cut, and let the drops seep into their blood. The effect was faster, stronger, and more immediate. It bypassed the stomach and gave them the release they craved within minutes. Once the laudanum took hold, they slumped back, eyes rolling, body limp, retreating into hours of oblivion. The cuts were wiped quickly, bandaged clumsily, and hidden beneath sleeves. Then the cycle repeated. Some of these women and men bore arms so covered in scars that no fabric could fully conceal them. Servants tasked with laundering blood-stained cloths whispered quietly among themselves, but never spoke to outsiders. The family name demanded silence. Better to clean the sheets again than risk scandal. Visitors saw only long sleeves and pale faces. No one mentioned the trembling hands or the faint smell of laudanum that clung to the air. The physical toll was immense. Their bodies weakened faster than ever. Infections spread from wounds that were never cleaned properly. Fevers rose, skin discoloured, and strength faded. Yet none of this stopped them. The desire for laudanum was stronger than the threat of death. They continued cutting, continued pouring, continued surrendering themselves to the drug. If we compare this to today, it would be like seeing someone inject narcotics into open wounds, knowing they risk infection and death, but being powerless to stop because the craving has consumed everything. Doctors, when confronted with such cases, rarely addressed the reality. Families begged for discretion, and physicians obliged. They wrote vague reports, avoided words like addiction, and offered yet more sedatives. In some cases, they prescribed laudanum again, as though the answer to self-inflicted wounds was more of the same poison. Their silence preserved reputations, but it also condemned patients to further decline. For the addicts themselves, shame mixed with compulsion. Many knew their actions were horrifying, yet the pull of the drug outweighed everything else. They hid their arms, avoided mirrors, and prayed no one would discover their secrets. Some wrote of their despair in diaries, describing how they no longer recognized themselves. Others said nothing, carrying their shame silently until the end. Their lives became chains of cuts and doses, pain replaced by fog, scars replaced by silence. Servants continued to witness, but their words remained trapped. They cleaned blood from basins, disposed of bandages, and washed garments stained beyond saving. Each task reminded them of the reality they could never reveal. Some pitied their employers, others recoiled in disgust, but all kept silent. To speak would mean dismissal, and so the secret stayed locked behind walls of wealth and fear. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining how many servants carried these images with them for life, powerless to intervene yet forced to participate in the concealment. The families bore their own burdens of denial. Husbands avoided their wives' arms, children were told nothing, and relatives invented excuses for absences. The truth, that their loved ones had mutilated themselves for a drug, was too heavy to face. Silence preserved appearances but erased compassion. The addict was no longer treated as part of the family but as a shadow to be hidden, managed, and ignored. The damage extended beyond the physical. The cuts and the scars were not only marks on skin but symbols of how completely laudanum had taken control. Addiction erased dignity, stripped away choice, and left only desperation. To pour medicine into wounds was not only an act of dependence but of surrender. It showed how far people could fall when society refused to recognize or address the truth. These horrifying practices were not rare exceptions but symptoms of a broader crisis. They revealed what silence, stigma, and denial had created. Addicts left to decline in secret found ever more desperate ways to continue, and society, unwilling to admit its role, allowed it to happen. The result was a hidden world of mutilation and despair, locked behind curtains and disguised by long sleeves. The quiet horror of these actions marked one of the darkest chapters of laudanum's grip. Families looked away, doctors supplied more, and servants bore silent witness. The addicts themselves bore scars that told stories no one dared to repeat. And through it all, the drug continued its work, consuming lives in ways more terrifying than anyone wanted to admit. They no longer felt pain, only craving. Their arms bore scars of countless cuts, their bodies wasted, and their families denied the truth. The bottles that once promised comfort now demanded blood, and as these desperate acts spread, the silence surrounding them revealed just how far laudanum had destroyed not only individuals but the very humanity of a society unwilling to speak its name. Death came quietly for laudanum addicts, and when it did, there was little mourning left to give. Families that had once clung to denial and silence often met the end with resignation rather than grief. By the time the addict passed away, they had already been erased from daily life, hidden in rooms, forgotten at gatherings, and spoken of only in whispers. Their departure brought relief more than sorrow. For many households, it meant the closing of a chapter too shameful to acknowledge. Funerals, when they happened at all, were small and unremarkable. There were no large gatherings, no processions, no elaborate services. Families preferred to keep everything quiet. Servants carried out the arrangements discreetly. Burials took place quickly, and names were rarely spoken aloud in church. In many cases, even relatives were not informed until long afterward. Silence, once used to hide addiction, now hides the death itself. It is almost bitterly ironic that Victorian society celebrated grand funerals for the wealthy, but reduced the deaths of laudanum addicts to hurried burials without tears. The graves of these victims often bore no markers. Families avoided inscriptions, fearing gossip or unwanted attention. Sometimes the body was placed in family plots, but without names etched in stone. In other cases, they were buried apart, in corners of cemeteries where few would look. The effect was deliberate erasure. To acknowledge their deaths would have meant acknowledging their lives, and that was something many households refused to do. Within the homes, possessions were cleared away quickly, diaries were burned, letters destroyed, and clothing discarded. The rooms where addicts had spent their final years were scrubbed clean, redecorated, or closed off entirely. Families wanted no trace of what had happened to remain. Children grew up with few reminders, learning only vague stories about illness or frailty. Servants were ordered to keep silent. The person who had once been part of the family was effectively erased from history. The emotional detachment was striking. Husbands who had abandoned their wives years earlier felt no obligation to grieve. Children, often raised away from their mothers, barely remembered them. Siblings spoke of them as if they had already died long before. The addict's life had ended socially long before it ended physically. Death was simply the final act of disappearance. If we compare this to today, it would be like a family quietly burying a relative who overdosed, never mentioning their name again and pretending they had never existed. Doctors rarely attended these funerals. Their names were kept out of discussions, though many had prescribed the laudanum that led to their death. Neighbours, if they noticed the absence, rarely asked questions. Society preferred the comfort of ignorance. A woman who no longer appeared at gatherings was simply described as unwell, and her eventual death was passed over without comment. The silence ensured that no lessons were learned, no changes made. Servants bore the final duties in these endings. They prepared the body, carried it to carts, and stood silently at burials where few others attended. They knew the truth, but their voices carried no weight. Their loyalty demanded silence, even as they watched families erase the memory of their mistresses or masters. Some felt pity, others anger, but all were bound by the same system that valued reputation more than compassion. I cannot help but feel unsettled by how entire lives could be erased so completely, as if a person's suffering and death had never happened at all. This erasure left no space for remembrance. There were no stories passed down, no memorials kept alive. The addicts became invisible in history, their names removed from family records, their portraits hidden or destroyed. Generations grew up without knowing they had relatives who had suffered in this way. The silence stretched beyond lifetimes, leaving nothing but absence. The cruelty lay not only in the neglect of the living, but in the refusal to honour the dead. These women and men had once been vibrant, social, and admired. Laudanum had reduced them to shadows, and death should have offered peace. Instead, it brought erasure. Their final rest was not accompanied by mourning, but by deliberate forgetting. Families chose to bury not only the body, but the truth. In this way, laudanum's destruction reached beyond the grave. It claimed not only lives but legacies. It wiped names from records, removed faces from portraits, and silenced stories that might have warned others. The victims became ghosts in the truest sense, present in memory only as absences, never spoken of directly. Their suffering ended without acknowledgement, their deaths without justice. The silence that followed these deaths was not accidental. It was part of the same denial that had allowed laudanum to flourish in the first place. Families, doctors, and communities had all chosen not to speak, and that silence carried through to the end. The addict's death was simply folded into the larger lie that nothing was wrong. And so the cycle continued, with others taking up the bottles, unaware of the fates of those who came before. They died without funerals, were buried without names, and were remembered by no one. Their families cleared their rooms, erased their records, and continued as though they had never lived. The cruelty of laudanum lay not only in the suffering it caused, but in the silence that followed. Death, instead of offering peace, brought only oblivion, and in that oblivion, the victims of laudanum disappeared from the world entirely. They died quietly, were erased quickly, and were remembered by no one. Families buried them in silence, destroyed their words, and wiped their names from history. But even as the dead were erased, the drug remained, ensuring that the cycle of silence would claim more lives in the years to come. The memory of laudanum's victims faded as quickly as their lives had ended. There were no monuments raised in their honour, no ceremonies to mark their suffering, and no tributes to the countless men and women who had lost everything to the drug. They vanished into silence, erased not only by death but by the deliberate choice of society to forget. For a culture that celebrated progress, industry, and morality, the lives lost to laudanum were considered an inconvenience, best hidden and never spoken of again. Diaries that told the truth were destroyed. Some were burned by families desperate to erase any evidence of shame. Others were locked away in drawers or trunks, sealed from view and destined to be lost with time. These journals contained confessions, hallucinations, and cries for help, yet they were denied the dignity of survival. What should have been testimonies of human struggle became ashes or forgotten pages. It is almost absurd that the same society that preserved endless records of factory output and rail schedules deliberately erased the voices of those who suffered in silence. Letters suffered the same fate. Final notes left unfinished on writing desks were hidden from view, torn apart before they could be read aloud. Words that could have offered warning or understanding were silenced. Families told themselves this was protection, sparing others from shame, but it was erasure all the same. What remained was a void where truth should have been. Portraits disappeared too. Some were removed from walls, others painted over, and many simply left to rot in storage. The women who had once been admired for their beauty or grace became ghosts without faces. Families preferred empty frames to reminders of what had happened. Generations later, children grew up never knowing the faces of their mothers or grandmothers, their images lost alongside their stories. Society's refusal to remember was not only an act of shame, but also an attempt to move forward without guilt. The Victorian era prided itself on advancement. Industry grew, cities expanded, and new inventions filled the world with noise and promise. To acknowledge laudanum's victims would have meant admitting that progress had been built on silence, denial, and suffering. Instead, people chose to look ahead, leaving the past buried. If we compare this to today, it would be like a nation ignoring an entire generation lost to an epidemic, choosing to celebrate its technology and wealth while never building memorials for those who died. The result was a strange emptiness in the historical record. Newspapers that had once carried small stories about sudden deaths eventually stopped mentioning them. Medical journals, when they spoke of laudanum, did so in technical terms, avoiding the human tragedies. Families locked their secrets away, ensuring that personal histories were broken and incomplete. The collective memory was carefully edited, leaving no space for the addicts who had once filled bedrooms, taverns, and graveyards. Yet the silence itself tells a story. It shows how unwilling society was to confront its own complicity. Doctors who prescribed laudanum, pharmacies that profited from its sales, and families that enforced silence all participated in this forgetting. The absence of memory was not accidental. It was constructed, layer by layer, until entire lives had been wiped from existence. I cannot help but feel deeply unsettled when I imagine how many people lived and died without even the dignity of being remembered, erased not only by the drug but by the people who should have preserved their stories. What makes this erasure more tragic is the scale. This was not a handful of isolated cases, but thousands across Britain and beyond. Every neighbourhood, from the poorest slums to the richest estates, had its hidden victims. Yet history books mention them only in passing, as footnotes in discussions of medicine or addiction. Their suffering, immense and widespread, was reduced to silence by choice. The transition to a new century made this forgetting easier. As the Victorian era gave way to modernity, society embraced electricity, motor cars, and new technologies. The old world of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages faded, and with it, the quiet horrors of laudanum were left behind. Few wanted to carry the weight of memory into the future. The result was a collective amnesia, a determination to bury the past beneath the glow of new inventions. In this way, laudanum's victims lost more than their lives. They lost their place in history. They became invisible, their stories untold, their names unspoken. Their absence reveals the darker side of progress, the price of denial, and the cruelty of silence. What should have been lessons for future generations became forgotten tragedies. Yet if one looks closely, traces still remain. Old medical notes, hidden letters, and faint whispers in family records hint at the scale of the epidemic. Servants' testimonies, when they dared to share them, provide glimpses of what was hidden behind curtains and closed doors. These fragments remind us that silence was never complete, that even in a society determined to forget, truth left its marks. The story of laudanum is more than a tale of addiction. It is a story of how societies choose what to remember and what to erase. It reveals how shame can silence truth, how denial can erase generations, and how progress can be built on hidden suffering. The absence of monuments and the destruction of diaries tell us as much as any statue or speech. What was forgotten shows us what society feared to face. In the end, Laudanum's victims disappeared twice. First in life, when the drug consumed their bodies and minds. Second in death, when society erased their memory. No monuments, no ceremonies, no records, just silence. And in that silence lies the true measure of the tragedy. They left no statues, no journals, no remembered names. Families erased them, society forgot them, and history moved on without them. Their absence is their legacy, a silence that still lingers when we look back at the polished image of Victorian progress. Beneath the grandeur and the morality, the empire built itself on denial, leaving thousands of voices unheard. And so we end this story of Laudanum, a tale of lives consumed, silenced, and erased. The victims are gone, their memories destroyed, their histories forgotten. But in remembering them now, we can see the price of silence, the cruelty of denial, and the human cost of progress. Thank you for listening to this journey into the shadows of Victorian life. May the forgotten find peace in our remembrance, and may their silence remind us of the need to speak where they could not. Good night, and sleep well.